This guy obviously knew computers and was pretty paranoid. He's, often said, this would destroy me if it ever got out. Ali counterintel.txt is a document that was found by law enforcement on Ross Ulbricht's computer after he was arrested for being the owner and operator of the Silk Road Darknet marketplace. The document itself is a cut and paste that he made of tidbits of information from a couple of different sources that were provided to him while he was still running Silk Road as the Dread Pirate Roberts. And the bulk of the document is information that was being supplied by someone using the name Alpacino. And I understand that he also used the name Notwonderful. Like most of us, he had more than one name on Silk Road.
At this point in time, I'm sure many of you are familiar with bits and pieces of the Silk Road story. It's hard not to be, given the fact that this darknet market was a very significant part of the early cryptocurrency scene, being one of the first major use cases for Bitcoin. In fact, by the time the site had shut down in 2013, it accounted for some 9.5 million Bitcoin in revenue. This figure is particularly striking given the fact that there were only 11.75 million Bitcoin in circulation at that time. Now, if you stop to think about this for a moment, had the Silk Road not proved to be this early catalyst to Bitcoin's value, you might stop to wonder if we would have seen the same timeline for the crypto world in the years after that.
Mt. Gox, the Tokyo-based Bitcoin exchange, is filing for bankruptcy protection.
The FBI says Benthal, who went by the online name DEFCON, was running Silk Road 2.0 since last December.
A Canadian man who died while in custody in a Thai prison is now accused of being an online king.
Whoa, what's up?
Along with his death, the problem here is also access to his laptop.
Cryptocurrency in the new year after Bitcoin took a huge dive in 2018. All eyes are looking ahead to what happens in 2019.
Popular Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT series says hackers stole about $360,000 worth of the digital assets.
Over the month-long trial, prosecutors argued Bankman-Fried stole billions of dollars from customers to back his crypto-focused hedge fund, Alameda Research.
Aside from the creation of Bitcoin, it's hard to think of a single other story that carries as much of an impact on the modern cybercrime landscape as the Silk Road. And while this impact is plainly seen through the stories it's linked to in this sort of butterfly effect, I think what often gets overlooked is the fact that this has effectively led to a new subgenre of research in criminology. It's led to new law enforcement divisions. It's led to new companies in the private sector. And while it's obviously led to a favorite bit of subject matter here on this channel, I think I should lay the groundwork for today's deep dive by really emphasizing to you that the Silk Road story is not just about the trial and conviction of Ross Ulbricht. Just as YouTube has become this platform for various internet sagas to be played out and documented, the Silk Road was just essentially a platform for criminal activity, where each participant has their own story to tell. And over the past decade, it seems that we've seen bits and pieces of these stories continue to make their way out to the public, each one crazier than the next. And I must say, for a case that serves as such a landmark on the modern cybercrime landscape, one might expect more extensive and detailed coverage beyond just the medium of books. Now, while there has been significant mainstream coverage, I've found that it often falls short when it comes to providing a complete and accurate picture. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I recently sat down to watch that Silk Road movie that came out in 2021, and while I'd been told it was poorly made, I wondered how it could have turned out so bad given the fact that the source material is so interesting. As it turns out, the director of the film elects to omit nearly every single detail that made the original case interesting, and instead focuses on a completely fabricated storyline that is apparently based on the director's own personal biography and stories from his life. What?
Okay, so what's factual and what's fictional?
Yeah.
What's factual and what's fictional? And I, at a certain point, I was like, I need to pour myself into this because there was a limited amount of information. And so then when the information ran out, it was like, okay, what am I going to pour in here? I can research it the way I would do a doc, but really, if I'm going to make this something that's true and authentic to me, I kind of poured myself into it. So that's what I ended up doing.
Between all of the chat logs, all of the data found on Ross's computer, all of the old Reddit threads, forum archives, interviews, side stories, various criminal indictment paperwork, and the complete timeline that had been public for years, I can't comprehend someone actually running out of information unless they just chose not to look for it. But I digress. Even when I released the video of the dark side of the Silk Road, it wasn't to give a complete picture. It was to highlight a side of the story that wasn't frequently talked about. In it, we focused on the characters Lucy Drop, Friendly Chemist, and Red and White, and their relation to Ross. In that particular video, I highlighted why that side of the story was often omitted for political reasons. Given that Ross is often viewed favorably in libertarian circles, it's obviously a bit of an inconvenient detail for said political organization that this guy attempted to orchestrate hits on as many as 5 people. And while quote-unquote hit number 6 could very well be seen as entrapment as the situation arose through an undercover federal agent, given the political astroturfing, the general public still struggles to delineate details between the two hitman storylines. And this is where the Free Ross political organization has fought tooth and nail to obfuscate details to distance Ross from the other Red and White saga. While I obviously agreed that Ross's sentencing was over the top, there's rarely any kind of room for this nuance in political discussion, especially when details like this can affect the bottom line when it comes to things like political contributions. And while I've since heard through the grapevine that Ross's family is understandably not a fan of my work, at the end of the day, Ross is out of prison, and the propaganda surrounding this case was simply a means to an end. But that's not to say that the coverage in the Silk Road has had blind spots from simply one side, or that this is the only side of the story that you're missing. You see, often when the federal agents discuss the Silk Road case, they tend to overlook and simplify details concerning the corruption involved. Instead, from the law enforcement perspective, many of these interviews focus on celebrating the takedown of the website, creating an impression that the case was straightforward and free of unresolved issues. However, the reality is that numerous complex and unresolved elements still exist within the case. And that's really why we're revisiting this subject, because aside from a small bit of coverage in 2016, this intriguing chapter of the Silk Road saga has been largely overlooked. And I must say, if you actually choose to sift through the data, if you actually choose to take a closer examination, if you actually choose to fully follow this thread, the story begins to unravel much further. Where, when it comes to the data regarding this case, you're left with a pretty major discrepancy. That being the mystery of LECounterintel.txt.
Eventually, Ross Ulbricht's laptop was seized with all of his chat records on it. He had full disk encryption on his laptop, and if he had just been able to close the lid of it, he could have protected all of that evidence, which I think made him kind of overconfident. The FBI, in this elaborate sting operation in the San Francisco library, grabbed his laptop out of his hands with an undercover agent, got everything. So you could see his conversations with Variety Jones and all of the other people working for him. And you could see the Variety Jones at one point suggested this idea, like, call yourself the Dread Pirate Roberts. Then if you're ever caught, you can tell this whole story, like from The Princess Bride, the movie, where that name comes from. That's just a kind of rotating handle that it's inherited by one. And that seemed to be laying the groundwork for the defense he actually would use in his trial.
Now look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This topic is a tangled web of characters. But I'd argue that the reason so few people have dug into the Alpacino saga within the Silk Road is simple. It demands a lot of background context. You need to first be familiar with the overview of the case, which luckily we covered in part 1. But you'll also need to have a familiarity with the data found on Ross's computer. Building off of that, you need to also understand the documented corruption as well as the 3 separate departments and the investigations that were concurrent into the Silk Road, as the storyline converges on all of these details simultaneously. So before we can get into the specifics of lecounterintel.txt, let's first walk you through the data that was found on Ross's computer, as I think it's important to get a closer familiarity before we proceed. Now, the first thing that you'll notice when you take a look through Ross's laptop is the fact that he's first and foremost absurdly organized. He has detailed journal entries. He kept detailed accounting logs for the Silk Road. He kept his hiring questions saved in a text document. And he even went as far as to create a net worth calculator for his situation. As you can imagine, he can't tell friends what he's working on, so effectively he uses various notes to reduce the cognitive load. It's effectively the guy's second brain, which extends far beyond notes just regarding the Silk Road. The laptop includes many details from his personal life, such as previous business ventures, dates he's going on, and even video games he was playing in his spare time, such as EVE Online. Entailed in this organization is the fact that he writes yearly reflections around the start of each new year. But then as the Silk Road shifts into its final year, there's something incredibly strange that occurs within the data. It's almost as if the organization goes by the wayside, as within the last year, the financial picture for the Silk Road had grown more and more convoluted. Between the blackmail saga with Friendly Chemist, the Curtis Green hit for $80K, the Bitcoin stolen by Sean Bridges, and the various bug bounties, DDoS attacks, and so on, Ross's notes indicate a constant barrage where the full extent of these problems aren't even fully documented within the laptop data. Recently released documents from the DOJ revealed 2 major hacks that Ross had hidden from his users. The first of which came in May of 2012, where some 70,000 Bitcoin was later seized in 2020, where the identity of the hacker has since remained hidden from public view, as DOJ documents simply label them as individual X. And while lightning rarely strikes twice, obviously hacks are more commonplace. The second major hack took place in September of 2012, where a man by the name of James Zong had hacked some 50,000 Bitcoin, where the stash would later be seized in 2021. Notably, both of these people sat on their Bitcoin for years, leading to these being some of the largest crypto seizures in history, accounting for some $4.36 billion collectively. And while these setbacks took place in 2012, come 2013, the drama with the Silk Road never really took a day off. Where, interestingly, the growing disorganization that appears within the files seems to coincide with the mounting pressure. Within Ross's final journal entry, entered just a day before his capture, he explicitly writes that he's struggling to stay positive. And it's almost as if he could feel the walls closing in. As you can imagine, organization takes a back seat alongside the realization that law enforcement is crawling all over his website and attempting to compromise members of his staff. Where around the same time, he's actively seeking a cutout in the Dominican Republic and seeking to get all sorts of false identification. Now, unbeknownst to Ross, the individual he was negotiating with to acquire a passport was actually Karl Mark Force, a corrupt undercover federal agent, but that is obviously besides the point. Ross was fully aware that there were efforts underway to infiltrate his organization, and that is a point that seldom gets mentioned when it comes to broader discussions of the Silk Road. And given this fact, the name lecounterintel.txt should start to make a bit more sense, as it's shorthand for law enforcement counterintelligence.txt. Now that we have established the backdrop for this story within the data, the next question that naturally gets posed here is, to what extent was Ross aware? Clearly, he still got caught, but as you start to explore this thread further, more things start to unravel. The inception of LE-counterintel.txt can be traced back to when Ross discovers an attempt by law enforcement to bribe two of his key staff members. The first individual was same but different, whom I'll refer to as SSBD for short for the rest of this video. Real name Peter Nash, where come June of 2013, they were just promoted to an administrator on the Silk Road. The second of the two was Scout, real name unknown, where they were a veteran forum moderator. And the conduit for these two was a user by the name of Mr. Wonderful. While the account was first created in May of 2013, it wouldn't be until the beginning of June that Ross would hear of this particular effort from his staff, whom claimed he had reached out to them by email. While Ross seems to be initially skeptical, as he states that they're, quote, claiming to be law enforcement within his journal, located in LE-counterintel.txt is the login information for both of these key staff members' email. With one distinct difference, Ross also appeared to keep the login information of Scout's Silk Road forum account as well. Now, the story behind this is rather convoluted, and while first-hand documentation here is sparse, users on the Silk Road 2 forums, reflecting on the first iteration, nicknamed the event Emailgate, where one user wrote, "In Emailgate, Scout told DPR that she had received an email to her Tormail email account from someone claiming to be an FBI agent and providing evidence of the same, telling her something along the lines of, 'You're not as anonymous as you all think. We're working on taking Silk Road down. However, at this time, we're looking for an in to the Silk Road team, and you'll be rewarded with a percentage of the proceeds seized when Silk Road is taken offline.'" Now, while a Darknet forum post is obviously a sketchy source of information, when it comes to Emailgate, as I mentioned, the specifics are murky as we don't know exactly what was said, but the overarching narrative told here does seem to be correct. Given that the Mr. Wonderful operation was largely off limits for discussion at Ross's trial, we're left to piece together the full story through tangential pieces of evidence. What we do know from court transcripts is that while law enforcement would later compromise Scout, they had not been successful in gaining access to their forum account tied to that particular identity. So this suggests that as a result of the Mr. Wonderful ordeal, some internal struggle arose, or likely Scout had said or did something that had caused Ross to become skeptical of their loyalty, prompting him to take retaliatory action, as he did not just lock them out of their account, but also fired them around June 5th. We learn this from court documents concerning SSBD's sentencing, which showed that his recent promotion to an administrator was revoked, reverting him back to the position previously held by Scout. But despite being locked out, Scout's account would continue to be active, as Ross and Roger Clark would sock puppet the identity to interact with Mr. Wonderful directly and gain intel. On the other side of this, we know from court transcripts that the Mr. Wonderful persona was in fact held by a member of the Department of Homeland Security, more specifically, the Baltimore Division, as this detail is revealed in a rather obscure court document, that being a letter that was sent to Ross's judge, filed under seal in 2014. Now, while we will be revisiting this document here in a moment, all you need to know for now was that the Mr. Wonderful operation was essentially a scattershot attempt by Baltimore that didn't make it very far, as the operation is terminated sometime around late June. And this is further reflected in Ross's main journal, where when he finally gets around to updating it some 3 months later, we see that this attempt at counterintelligence didn't really lead anywhere. Regardless, the significance of the Mr. Wonderful op is that it effectively sets the stage for another character to make their way into Ross's circle, that being Not Wonderful, aka Alpacino, as this username is a direct reference to this operation. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. Sticking with the circumstances surrounding Emailgate for now, I should add that as a result of firing Scout This led to a rather awkward work management predicament for Ross. Now a man down, he still needs to replace that role. But given the fact that the feds were attempting to infiltrate these exact positions, it may have been difficult to find somebody new. And while the full reasoning here isn't fully clear, it seems the decision was made to bring Scout back, with the compromise being that they return under a new identity. Cirrus. Detailed within Ross's message to all of his employees was the included tagline that they had put whatever had occurred with Mr. Wonderful behind them: water under the bridge. But unbeknownst to all of them, this would turn out to be a fatal error that consequently ensured the Silk Road's downfall. Because while all of this was going on, another thread of the story had been occurring in the background that would only come to the forefront with his arrest. Back in the day, Nomad Bloodbath was perhaps one of the most prolific usernames within the Silk Road community. After hearing about the Silk Road on 4chan, he quickly rose to prominence in 2011, being named the first moderator within the site's history. And while by 2013 he had fallen out of that working relationship with DPR, he still remained active. But aside from being a well-known vendor and voice within the community that aligned himself with the ideals espoused by Silk Road, Nomad was also known for one other thing: his artwork. Indeed, his chalkboard skulls were a bit of a fan favorite, with many users mentioning that they would purchase one if given the opportunity. But despite having maintained this noteworthy reputation for years, something strange occurred with his account on April 1st, 2013. After making a rather routine set of posts in the off-topic section, Nomad would disappear for some time. Now, this wasn't something that was too uncommon for Nomad. He had taken breaks before, but when he finally returns on May 24th, he makes a post in the vendor-only section, where there's a slight shift in his tone. Currently, my IRL time is filled with much more important personal things, and frankly, my politics simply do not align with Silk Road's pseudo-agenda. Many know I've been unhappy here for quite some time, and for me, what's best is that I take a much-deserved and earned vacation from this type of activity. I've got a wedding and married life coming up, and need to concentrate on not running around all over tour. I'm not saying come end of summer I might not reappear, but for now I need to take a leave and tally up what's best for Nomad, gain some much needed perspective, and also get my health back up to par. So I have roughly 10 skulls at this time for sale, and then I'm done for the season. I decided to give back a bit and offer them to you guys first before I open them up to the community. And I'm giving them to you guys first come first serve for 50% off with free shipping. It's been a blast, and hit me up through PM on the Silk Road if interested. I could use all of the last bitcoins I'll have for a while. Nomad. Now, upon his return, he conveniently has a new PGP key, where had anybody been paying attention, this should have raised a massive red flag that it wasn't the same person behind the computer in April. You see, Nomad was actually compromised at the time of this post, and while the specifics around his arrest aren't fully clear in terms of public reporting, this inevitably led to an operation that would be critical in the Silk Road's infiltration. Nicknamed the Trojan Skull by the Darknet researcher La Mustache, this separate effort carried out by HSI Chicago leveraged Nomad's notoriety and legend status on the Silk Road forums to ship various artwork skulls to various key vendors to dox them, as by making this post in the vendor-only section, it would allow them to target these vendors in mass. But as fate would have it, this operation would prove to be more than both sides bargained for. Burned within the forum archives, we can see that within the same thread, SSBD would claim that he would have one skull en route to him on June 20th, 2013. This will later lead to his capture in December of that year. And while lightning rarely strikes twice, it seems that the feds got their own 2-for-1 deal with this one as well. Because when it came to Scout aka Cirrus, they used to be very close with Nomad, as over time they had developed their working relationship when they both upkept the forums. Now, seeing that he had returned, this eventually led to a rather heartfelt conversation, where according to one article, unaware that she was talking to a law enforcement agent instead of her friend, cat-loving Scout poured out her heart to Nomad Bloodbath, and in return, Duryagan offered to send her one of the skulls for free. Having got her home address, he then went along with the raid. We protected the cat did not get harmed, and in the spy thriller vernacular, Scout agreed to turn for the HSI. All Scout had to do was hang around the website, be our eyes and ears.
Well, good morning. In 2012 and 2013, 2 federal agents were investigating the Silk Road website where users could buy and sell illegal drugs using the web-based currency known as bitcoins. But federal prosecutors now say those 2 agents were actually benefiting from the very site they were trying to bring down, information that is threatening to undermine one of the Department of Justice's most important cases.
So in essence, when Ross hires Scout back, he's just hired on a mole, where the reason we don't know her identity is due to her cooperation. And for a bit of background, while Scout obviously wasn't your typical cat lady, she got involved with the Silk Road initially through running an off-the-books Bitcoin exchange through the handle called Captain Mal, where in essence, she was effectively a money launderer for the Silk Road. Naturally, any reliable off-ramp for money out of the market was an appreciated service by various vendors, so as a result, she had become an integral figure within the community. When Scout finally gets promoted to a moderator, she retires the Captain Mal handle, and thus the new name, Scout, came about. But origin story aside, after the raid on her home, she would then go on to coach Jared Duryagan on all of these details, as well as how to talk and act like her. But the real key point I should highlight is the fact that her cooperation extended to the effort of HSI Chicago. Because within the broader context of the Silk Road story, there's this rather complex intra-agency dynamic. You see, while on one hand all of the various agencies were cooperating for the takedown, they're also simultaneously within this competition to see who would get credit for what. And as if the story isn't already convoluted enough, there's also the ever-present fact that one of the divisions had rampant corruption. And in hindsight, it's rather remarkable to think that had Baltimore gotten access to Scout, there's a decent chance that the story I'm telling you today would be so vastly different that potentially much of the Silk Road data may have never even seen the light of day. You see, when it comes to the laptop, Scout's cooperation with Chicago was a large factor in what ultimately allowed that library sting to occur, as Ross had been chatting with Cirrus at the time of his capture. And when it comes to the server data, after the FBI cybercrime division had located the Silk Road servers, Scout's infiltrated position was crucial when it came to selecting a time to image the servers and avoid detection. While HSI Chicago and the FBI Cybercrime Division were instrumental in driving progress forward, Baltimore's track record was notoriously the opposite, as the lead undercover agent Carl Mark Force, formerly with the DEA, seemed more focused on dragging the case out for personal gain. And over the past decade, the drama surrounding this division has become some of the most popular Darknet lore to date, as much of the media attention back in the day was set around the sensational events of the infamous Maryland indictment. But it's only once you take a closer look at what corruption was documented and then compare it against the data found on Ross's computer that you're left with an absolutely insane discrepancy. Now, despite being known for its corruption, ironically, HSI Baltimore was the division that was specifically organized to address the Silk Road issue at hand. Nicknamed Operation Marco Polo, it brought in members from the DEA and Secret Service to address this novel type of case. And while the efforts here were initially effective at apprehending some vendors early on, things go completely off the rails in January of 2013. So much so that come the end of the same year, the lead undercover within this division had lost the plot so much that he actually goes as far as to attempt to help Ross avoid capture by selling him information on the active investigation. But to best understand how all of this went down, I'll start by stating that while lightning rarely strikes twice, Ross was hit with two separate court cases. And the one that everyone's familiar with is the one out of New York, where he received 2 life sentences plus 40 years for the operation of the Silk Road, and while he has since been pardoned. The second case out of Maryland involved Ross's attempt to order a hit on his employee, Curtis Green. However, the circumstances surrounding this reflected so poorly on the government that the case was ultimately dropped. Now, while I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the broad strokes of the Maryland indictment, for the sake of what we need to cover today, I'll have to walk you through this with a bit more detail. So let's go back to early 2013. Nearing the end of 2012, HSI Baltimore, through their lead undercover, had worked their way into a position of trust with Ross. Posing as a Puerto Rican cartel middleman through the handle called Knob, Carl Mark Force positioned himself as a wholesaler type to other vendors by advertising the sale of bulk quantities for various substances. While these listings generated a lot of attention for their higher price tag, this was sort of out of place when compared to the retail quantities that Silk Road was accustomed to. But even more off-putting was Knob's suggestion to buyers that they opt for a dead drop instead of a shipment. And some were even perceptive enough to properly sniff out the fact that he was law enforcement well before any of this was public. Now, despite Knob's reputation being almost universally negative among other users on Silk Road, by December of 2012, he had somehow gained so much favor with Ross that the storyline actually begins with Ross personally trying to help Knob secure bulk buyers with his support and seal of approval. And given this massive expositional gap, you may be wondering how we got to this point in the first place. But unfortunately, the lead up to this in terms of documentation is missing, as Carl didn't properly archive his PGP messages that he had with Ross while working undercover. But that being said, I did manage to find an absurdly obscure detail that gives us at least a partial glimpse into what happened. Within one of the chat logs found on Ross's computer, there's a passing mention to a, quote, guy from Africa, where he writes, "Remember that guy in Africa? You wanted me to put a gun to that guy's head while he's logged on Silk Road and take a picture. You want that?" Now, look, I've searched everywhere online to find more information on this mysterious guy from Africa. But this detail has never been once reported, and the only reference I could find to it online was from the Darknet researcher Gwern over a decade ago in a Reddit thread, where even he's not sure what to make of it. While obviously there's an entire storyline missing here, it's apparent that Carl offered some favor or did something for Ross to be viewed as a legit cartel member, while the rest of the community was universally skeptical. Regardless, come December 7th, 2012, we learned from the Maryland indictment that Knob had complained about other users not being willing to move larger amounts. So, as a result, Ross agrees to search on his behalf to find a buyer, where shortly after, he delegates this task to his staff member, Flush, aka Curtis Green. After searching around for a bit, Curtis stumbles upon a UK-based vendor named Googly-Eyed One. Now, the original idea behind this deal would be that G1 would simply just purchase a kilo from Knob, but it seems that when push came to shove, Google didn't want to receive such a large quantity through the mail. So instead, Curtis takes it upon himself to work out a bit of a different deal outside of Ross's knowledge. Trusting that Knob was legit and had Ross's backing, Green offered to essentially be Google's dropshipper or fulfillment middleman for a cut. Referencing the Silk Road archives, we can see that Googly-Eyed was excited to push through with this new type of listing. And while the specific negotiations would take a few weeks, after the purchase was finalized, Google provides Knob with Curtis's address for the delivery. After receiving the package at his Utah home on January 17, 2013, this results in a raid where Curtis Green would turn for HSI Baltimore. While to the public it would only appear as though he were arrested for possession, behind the scenes, the case would progress to a debrief about a week later, where within their meeting, Curtis would inform the team at HSI Baltimore on every detail he knew about Silk Road, its creator, his role, and most importantly, the fact that his account had CSR permissions, which included the ability to reset pins and passwords for various users, and also direct access to many of the messages on the website. While this could have been instrumental in gathering intel, one federal agent saw a bit of a different opportunity. Sean Bridges, formerly with the Secret Service, had been assigned to the Baltimore Task Force as their cryptocurrency specialist. But it just so happened that after departing from this initial meeting, he spent the latter half of the night hacking every user he could on Silk Road, siphoning out balances aplenty. While this hack would progress into the early hours of the morning, this activity was noticed by one of Ross's staff members, Inigo, which prompts the following conversation.
I hope you get online soon. We're under attack, over 100k stolen. Shit's hitting the fan, you need to pull the plug on withdrawals. Over 300k stolen. I think I figured out how to contain it. As far as I can tell, it was flush, and he managed to steal a little over 350k. Either that, or somebody with access to his account. But my hunch is that it was him. Fortunately, I was able to stop it before I got any further. Looks like he took 900 bitcoins from the petty cash fund, and the rest by changing vendors' passwords and resetting their pins, and then logging into their accounts to wipe out their balances. I've been up all night frantically trying to stop this massive theft. I need to catch a few Z's. I'll be back on in a few hours, hopefully in time to see you get online.
Now, Ross would respond just a few minutes later.
You there? Yeah, this makes me sick to my stomach. Decrypted his ID and did some digging. He was arrested for energy powder possession last week. I think this stuff about his daughter was a tale. This will be the first time I have to call on my muscle. Effing sucks.
Now, for a bit of context, one of the accounts used by Bridges was a username by the name of Number 13, where he rerouted funds to this particular username before transferring it out. And while this could have been a much larger hack, Inigo had been quick to reset the password on Flesh's account, locking him out, where as a result, this had also blocked Baltimore from further surveillance. Regardless, 7 hours later, Ross would have the following conversation with Knob.
My friend, you up?
I am. How are you, amigo?
I'm tired, D. Real tired.
Not enough sleep?
Nah, I'm working too hard. Overseeing 3 good-sized loads coming in from South America up here to the US.
Lots of people to coordinate?
Yes. I just saw your message on SR.
Yeah, not a ton of money, but it pisses me off to no end. I trusted the guy too much.
Okay, who is it and where is he?
I'll send you his ID.
How?
I had him send it to me when I hired him, for just this kind of situation. He was recently arrested for nose candy possession on the 17th.
That wasn't the kilo that I sent, was it? Because I'm gonna be pissed.
Did you send it to Utah?
Yes, it's an address that Googly-Eyed gave to me, and I'm having problems with him/her.
Are you serious?
Yes, what the mierda?
Mierda?
What you want done? What the fuck is up with the Googly-Eyed? I don't need this shit. And who is this freaking idiot?
I'm incredibly sorry, Knob, but this guy on the ID, he's the one I asked you to set up with vendors. He must have somehow tricked you into sending the kilo to him instead of Googly-Eyed.
Okay, what do you want done with him?
He then took advantage of some of the tools I gave him to do vendor support, to rip a bunch of vendors off, who I will have to compensate.
I'm not worried. I didn't send it out. But googly-eyed worries me. You sure he/she is okay?
I'm not sure about googly-eyed. They were locked out of their account by this guy 24 hours ago. More like 12 hours ago. You didn't send the kilo? Or are you talking about a second order?
I sent the kilo and GI did pay, so GI is talking about doing a second order for 5 kilos to the UK.
You sent 1 kilo to the Utah address?
Yes, a Utah address. But like I said, I didn't send it, so I'll have to reach out and get the exact address.
Let me see if I understand.
I had my people send it. I never touched the dope.
You sent a kilo to googly-eyed, which you received. Where did you send that one? Who asked for the kilo to Utah?
Googly-eyed gave me an address in Utah to send the kilo. Googly-eyed requested that the kilo go to Utah.
Now, recall that Curtis didn't tell Ross about the redistribution agreements he had with Googly-eyed. So while Ross is trying to wrap his head around why a kilo was shipped to Utah, the two people closest to the situation, both Curtis and Googly-eyed, are locked out of their accounts. So the only person left to guide the conversation is an undercover federal agent who is obviously going to attempt to shift the focus away from himself.
Googly-eyed said she got it. That is why she finalized. But he/she isn't leaving feedback on SR, which is pissing me off.
Where was the first kilo sent? Was it Ireland?
To Utah.
Do you have the exact address?
Next 5 kilos are supposed to go to Ireland.
Does it match the ID? Okay, don't send them until I get to the bottom of this.
I have to call back to my guy who sent the kilo for me. Yes, I need you to let me know what is going on.
I will. What do you want to do about Curtis? If you can get someone to force him to return the stolen funds, that would be amazing.
Personally, I don't want any contact. I'm clear. If you want something done, I can help you discreetly.
What do you mean?
Do you want him beat up, shot, or just paid a visit?
I'd like him beat up, then forced to send the bitcoins he stole back. Like, sit him down at his computer and make him do it. Beat him up only if he doesn't comply, I guess? Not sure how these things usually go.
Remember that guy in Africa? You wanted me to put a gun to that guy's head while he is logged in on SR and take a picture? You want that?
No thanks. Just don't want him to have that money.
Okay, you just want him beat up and send the money back. The guy I'm going to send knows nothing about computers, so he won't know whether or not the mark has the funds, or even if he sent it.
We could give him a letter to give Curtis, so the message doesn't get mixed up. And if I know when he's going to be paying him a visit, I can tell him to log on to TorChat to talk to me while your man is there, so I can be logged in when he goes to his house.
Okay, you write the letter and send it to me. I'll get the exact address where the kilo was sent. Please check into Googly-eyed. This doesn't make sense to me.
Okay.
Just forget about Googly-eyed. I'm cutting ties. Be back in contact later today or tomorrow. Stay out of trouble. I can't lose you now. Should be can't lose you now. Freaking Spanish to English bullshit. So tired I can't think straight.
How quickly do you think you can get someone over there? And what does that cost you? Is it worth the hassle?
Not sure. It is going to cost money because it's not my people.
Okay, if it costs more than we can recover, then obviously we should not go through with it.
Shit. We don't need this. 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
I know. It's a pain.
Okay, talk at you.
We don't have to do anything if you don't want. Talk to you soon.
Okay, I'll let you know. I'm confident that I'm clear. Googly-eyed, on the other hand.
Now, following this exchange, where Ross was initially a bit uncertain, he then follows up some 20 minutes later with the aforementioned note, Bitcoin address, as well as instructions, where he then writes,
I'd actually like to go through with this, even if it costs more than we can recover. I would like to experience this in case something like this happens again.
Where finally Nob would respond,
Okay, got it. I'll get back to you with the address and see if I can get a friend over to visit your guy.
Okay, thanks, Nob.
No problem, my friend. Te amo.
I know some of this conversation might seem silly in hindsight. On one hand, it's really easy to question how Ross doesn't pick up on these obvious tells that Nob's identity is a fabrication. And on the other hand, you might start to notice that Carl's style is just a little bit off. He feels the need to interject Spanish and oversell the character a bit too much. But let me remind you, this was a high-stakes scenario where the moral and mental burden weighed heavily on both sides. And it's worth noting that this event led to two distinct shifts in both of these individuals' personalities. For Ross, this is the single event where he begins to justify paying to have people knocked off. Recall that in the year prior, the Silk Road had suffered 2 large hacks, where on each occasion, the individual left to foot the bill was Ross. But come the start of the next year, from Ross's perspective, even his own employees were now seemingly willing to cross him, where his growing frustration is evident in the chat logs. And if you're familiar with the frustration-aggression hypothesis in psychology, it suggests that individuals are more likely to commit acts of violence or aggression when they feel blocked from achieving a goal. While obviously psychology is a soft science and aggression can manifest itself in various ways, this framework is still helpful in explaining certain behaviors here. Because on the other side of this, with HSI Baltimore, they were similarly blocked from achieving their goal. For Carl, this moment marks a turning point. Operation Marco Polo had been investigating Silk Road for over a year, and this event appears to be the catalyst for Carl's corruption after a seemingly clean 15-year career with the DEA. That said, this hit wasn't a part of Carl's corruption. This was a government-sanctioned operation that went sideways due to Sean Bridges, ultimately resulting in entrapment. Regardless, while the link between life events and personality shifts is unmistakable, as we've all heard this phrase that pressure makes diamonds but also leads to rubble, it's safe to say that on this particular day, Ross isn't paying close attention to Nob's obvious tells. Because while waiting to hear back, within the chat logs, his mental state exhibits all the textbook symptoms of betrayal. While we've obviously seen anger, grief, and disbelief in the chat logs thus far, at the core of any kind of personal betrayal is a wound to one's self-esteem, where the individual will often lose trust in their own judgment for a time, where instead they'll seek out guidance from others, and that's where this conversation with Inigo comes into place.
You there?
Yep.
Okay, let's tackle the support page until we have everything zeroed. What are you working on right now?
Customer messages.
Okay, I'll do vendor messages.
Okay.
While I'm fixing this, you're with me, right, Inigo?
Yes, sir.
I mean, long term. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, or if I'm doing anything wrong.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I swore my loyalty to you, and I'll stick by that. I take pride in my loyalty above all other characteristics. Where I lack in other fields, you'll at least get your value out of me by having somebody loyal for life.
Thank you.
You've given me a chance at a financially secure future that I didn't have before. While Flush may have been a greedy scumbag, I'm here for the long run. If anything, just to show my gratitude.
Maybe guys like us are just rarer than I had hoped.
He clearly didn't want to wait and wanted to get rich quick. I'm willing to put in the long hours now and even struggle a little bit financially because I know that in the long run it'll pay off, and in a few years, I figure I'll be making enough that I won't have to worry about money. Even if it's 5 to 10 years from now, I see the long run opportunity.
That's good. So do I, obviously.
I've only been with you for 3 months, so I don't expect to have a new car and a nice place to live and all that good stuff just yet. I'm willing to earn it. What other details did you find out about Flush's arrest? Did it say how much he was caught with?
I haven't dug into it yet.
Yeah, I guess it's pretty early.
We want to move quickly, but I gave the whole mess over to my guy.
From here on out, the focus of the conversation with Inigo is them confirming the information they have on Curtis's ID. And once Ross is fairly certain that Curtis is the real target, he then sits down to have a conversation with his main advisor, Roger Clark. Now, obviously, we touched a bit on Variety Jones, aka Roger Clark, aka Simon, aka plural of Mongoose, a bit in the first episode and this one. But Roger Clark, once again, can be best thought of as Ross's mentor, as Ross quite literally describes him as such in one of his journal entries. But mentor title aside, Clark's influence can't be overstated enough, as he did not just come up with the name Dread Pirate Roberts, but Ross actually goes as far as to write in another journal entry,
"Chatted with VJ again today. Him coming onto the scene has re-inspired me and given me direction on the Silk Road project. He has helped me see a larger vision, a brand that people can come to trust and rally behind. Silk Road Chat, Silk Road Exchange, Silk Road Credit Union, Silk Road Market, Silk Road everything. And it's been amazing just talking to a guy who is so intelligent and in the same boat as me, to a certain degree, at least."
Given Clark's steady influence on Ross, alongside perhaps a slightly deteriorated state of mind due to the wake of the betrayal, I would hazard a guess that Ross is beginning to question his own judgment. But this next conversation can be best thought of as perhaps the final straw that broke the camel's back. And I'll jump to right where after the context had been filled in.
So Nob is pissed. I gave him his info when he asked for it. He won't do anything without my go, though. I don't think.
Yeah, he's been busted for coke. Right off the money. No way I'd send anyone in there, or go myself, with that kind of heat. Especially since he may still roll on SR for leniency.
Okay, I just hate getting ripped off.
However, it certainly effing gives Nob a wee bit of credibility.
Yeah, Nob's legit, but not quite as big time as he was making himself out to be.
Oh, I have a long memory, and the time to deal with Curtis is after he's out of his current predicament. I'll get on tracking him.
Says he makes $25 million a year. Yeah, but that money won't last long.
Sorry, back to Curtis for a sec. Since Smed is behind, instead of having Irish come out here in a few days, I could have them skip to Utah and see if this whole Curtis thing smells at all. Dumb Irishmen that can't use a smartphone don't fit our profile, so I'm sure he'd be cool.
That's fine with me. Would be good to put eyeballs on this guy. He may be in a jail cell for all we know, though.
Irish always knows a guy who knows a guy. We'd better get a handle on what's going on. I'd be most curious about his living arrangements. Did they go nuts seizing computer stuff, or just grab the guy and the drugs? Gotta talk to the neighbors, man. You've always gotta talk to the neighbors. It's the shit that happened after the bust that tells us what they're looking at now. When did he liberate the 350?
Yeah, let me get an exact. Around January 26th, 2013 at 8:50 a.m. UTC.
So he ain't in jail. And his computer shit wasn't taken. So the feds have no link there. Yet he still has lots of time to deal.
So he must be out on bail? He might be fleeing.
One would think. Well, he does have $350K, but it takes time to clear that. So he may be holding fast until he can get it out.
But with an arrest, it seems like it would be hard to flee. See, he sent the money to one address, right here, which still has $15K on it.
As a side note, at what point in time do we decide we've had enough of someone's shit and terminate them? Like, does impersonating a vendor to rip off a mid-level drug lord, using our rep and system, follows up by stealing from our vendors and clients and breeding fear and mistrust, does that come close, in your opinion?
Terminate? Execute?
Not to mention that whole common law breach of fiduciary duties and duty of care.
If this was the Wild West, and it kinda is, you'd just get hung for stealing a horse.
Yeah, pretty much. At what point in time is that the response? We're playing with big money with serious people, and that's the world they live in. I sure as hell don't want Nom to try it. F up, and then have our laundry aired.
Well, unfortunately, there's not much in between.
I know a guy, and he knows a guy who knows a guy. That gets things done.
In a perfect world, we'd get the money back, plus our expenses, and then maybe beat him up or something. But that's not realistic.
Nope, and it ain't the money. It's your fault, no one else's. Someday I'll tell you a long story from a guy who explained to me why situations like this are always your own fault.
So, yeah, it's a good question. I've been thinking about that in the last 24 hours. Oh, it's definitely my fault. I even thought of it before it happened. I could have taken 5 minutes and separated powers. I thought too much of him.
But he came at us from the inside, put many folks at risk, and he's facing a serious felony. He's def the kind of guy that would seal what little he knows for a break with the Phoebes.
That's true. He doesn't know much, but I've chatted with him quite a bit. He could have logs.
Dude, he was a CSR that could read PMs, reset passwords, mem harvest addies while emptying accounts, etc. He was smart enough to impersonate Ghoulie Dick, take Knob for some marching powder, and all with your assistance. Yeah, and chat logs. So you've had your time to think. You're sitting in the big chair, and you need to make a decision. Now, really, things could move fast in the future.
I would have no problem wasting this guy.
Well, okay then. I'll take care of it.
Now, if you're familiar with the Milgram experiment, then you already know one of the most unsettling truths it revealed. That the easiest way to get an ordinary person to justify causing harm, even murder, is through perceived legitimacy of an authority figure. And in Ross's case, it seems as though this is exactly what had happened. While Ulbricht was obviously the one to make the final decision, Roger Clark goes as far as to tell Ross in a later chat,
"You would have surprised me if you had balked and taken the step of bluntly killing Curtis for screwing up just a wee bit too badly. Also, if you had balked, I would have seriously reconsidered our relationship. We're playing for keeps. This just drives it home. I'm perfectly comfortable with the decision, and I'll sleep like a lamb tonight, and every night thereafter. Let's just try and not make a habit of this, okay?"
Well put.
Now, if you watch the first episode, you'll realize how ironic all of this is, as Ross had later become disturbingly comfortable with ordering hits, as he later racks up a killtacular. But even more poetically ironic is Ross's frank admission to Inigo at this time that his greatest fear associated with running the Silk Road was that he would become too drunk with power. Regardless, per the conversation with Roger Clark, aka Variety Jones, Ulbricht then reaches out to Nob, where Ross then renegotiates the situation to not just beat up Curtis, but instead terminate him for $80K. Acting in cooperation with HSI Baltimore, Carl and Curtis would act out a fake hit and torture to make Ross think that the deed had been done, so that the undercover operation could continue on. While many people like to point to Karl Mark Force as the primary villain in this particular story arc, it's important to recognize that if Force hadn't stepped in, Ross would have likely found someone else to take care of Curtis. This nuance is often overlooked in most coverage. But while the rest is history, this is perhaps the most well-known bit of Silk Road lore. But what is seldom talked about is the fallout thereafter.
Basically, this is a DEA agent. Carl Force was really on, with the DEA for 16 years. And then Sean Bridges, 32 years old, of Laurel, Maryland, he was at the U.S. Secret Service for 6 years. And really, Force, from what I've learned from the court documents, was the leader of this investigation and really, had a lot of intel and a lot of exposure to the people involved with this site. And Bridges was really able to go in and is the computer forensics person, the way it's been reportedly explained. And so they went in, allegedly used fake names, set up fake accounts, and lined their own pockets, essentially.
Now, following the events of the Maryland indictment, there's obviously quite a few loose ends to address here. For starters, despite being a major player and top vendor on Silk Road, Google-eyed eventually regained access to his account and resumed business as usual, even went as far as to warn others on the vendor roundtable about Nob. Ironically, while his warning ultimately fell on deaf ears, particularly for Ross, Google-eyed, who played a central role in the Maryland indictment, appears to be the only major figure who got off scot-free, as, to this day, no criminal complaint has ever materialized tied to this username. While one can only imagine where he is today, Inigo's identity would be discovered as a result of Ross's laptop, which included a picture of his driver's license. While Variety Jones would meet a similar fate after the feds tracked him down in Thailand. Notably, the full backstory behind this character is extensive, and that's not even bringing up the username plural of Mongoose, which could easily warrant a video of its own. But on the flip side, we have Curtis, who ended up getting framed for theft on both sides. Given that Sean Bridges had been acting alone in secret, this made the arrangement of him being a cooperating witness quite awkward. As one article from Vice had put it, Curtis Green didn't find out who had done him wrong until much, much later. While in hiding, he kept cooperating with the investigation, although getting the theft pinned on him had put his plea deal in jeopardy. Green gave a victim statement at Bridges' sentencing, openly sobbing in court. He told the judge that he had taught Force and Bridges how to move Bitcoin, how to essentially hide it, thinking that he was helping the investigation, since, quote, these are the good guys. While good is obviously a subjective term, when it comes to the documented corruption, Sean Bridges could best be described as the quiet and calculated one, where in stark contrast, Karl Mark Force was the exact opposite. In fact, Force's behavior had become too blatant to ignore come April of 2014, when the Bitcoin exchange Bitstamp noticed something suspicious. He was accessing his account using Tor on the exchange. Concerned by the unusual activity, they reached out to him to ask why. His reply? I utilize Tor for privacy. Don't particularly want NSA looking over my shoulder. Smiley face. That response raised red flags. Bitstamp reported the incident to his superiors, which triggered a lateral investigation by the San Francisco Department of Justice. Now, funnily enough, it seems that as a result of this investigation, Carl's sloppiness brought attention to Sean Bridges' corruption as a byproduct. And it wouldn't be until May of 2015 that all of this would be made public, where a noticeable pattern of behavior had emerged for each of them. For Sean Bridges, the game was basically to dip his hand in the cookie jar in any case that he was involved in. And to quote one article from Vice, according to prosecutor Catherine Wan, his involvement in the digital currency cases around the country caused a staggering number of investigations to become tainted and subsequently shut down. She told the judge at Bridges' sentencing that the corrupt agent had been looking for opportunities to serve seizure warrants and somehow profit from it. The prosecutor also said that bitcoins were still missing, and that they weren't sure if he had worked with other corrupt agents. The U.S. Attorney's Office seemed to imply that there had been a lot of weird, but not necessarily chargeable stuff that was still unaccounted for. In other words, she was convinced that Bridges hadn't really made a clean breast of it. One example she gave was a suspicious text conversation between Bridges and an unnamed IRS agent, who was not charged in this case, in which the two talked about how much money they were making on the market, presumably the digital currency market, even as Bridges boasted about guarding Mrs. Obama at that very moment. Now, after Bridges had stolen the money, he immediately moved it to Mt. Gox. While Bridges would sit on his hands for a bit, throughout February, he would coordinate to set up a business and an investment account later that month. But fast forward to May of that same year, Bridges would coordinate to withdraw some $820K from Mt. Gox on the 6th and the 7th. But just 2 days later, Bridges would be a part of the same team involved in the shakedown of Mt. Gox. So yes, he pulled out all of his money just days before serving that same exchange a seizure warrant, where this $500K discrepancy obviously signals a larger pattern of behavior. But Sean Bridges' story gets even stranger when it came to how his trial actually panned out. You see, facing charges on money laundering and wire fraud in 2015, his longtime girlfriend, Ariana Esposito, had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. At the time, they weren't married, but she had been cooperating with various federal agents. According to court records, when agents began to suspect that she wasn't telling the full truth, and even went as far as to threaten her with prosecution, she suddenly requested a 1-week delay for her testimony, and then over the next weekend got married to Bridges, where she then invoked spousal immunity. But while Bridges would still go on to plead guilty in June of 2015, he was scheduled to serve some 71 months the following year. But while lightning rarely strikes twice, come January 28, 2016, just 1 day before he was scheduled to report to prison, he was arrested again after the government had flagged him as a flight risk and found the following: 2 Pelican-style bags which contained identity documents, a passport card in Bridges' name, a notarized copy of Bridges' passport, corporate records for at least 3 different offshore entities ranging from Nevis to Belize to Mauritius, including one that Bridges had created on October 28, 2015, after he had pleaded guilty in this case, a Samsung cell phone, and a thumb drive. Also located in those bags were documents relating to his wife's, Ariana Esposito's, attempts to obtain citizenship in another country. Government agents also found a MacBook with a serial number scratched off, an iPad tucked between a bedroom mattress, and bulletproof vests, at least one of which had Secret Service markings, and thus is believed to have been stolen from the government. Now, considering Bridges was attempting to flee with funds stashed in various offshore entities, it's clear that not all of the Bitcoin was accounted for in his initial indictment. This comes full circle with one crucial detail. The stash of Bitcoin that federal prosecutors had missed was the very same stash that Bitstamp had originally frozen from Carl Mark Force. You see, while Carl's suspicious activity was reported in April of 2014, Bridges had been the federal agent to later serve a seizure warrant to Bitstamp in November of that year. While the total Bitstamp seizure totaled some $600,000, with Carl's stash being a third of that, by the time the government had issued their press release for Bridges' rearrest, that same seizure was worth $10 million. So while Bridges would face an extra 2 years in prison after being caught, his crypto stash wasn't the only thing that returned to zero. His marriage did too, as Miss Esposito had filed for divorce not long after his second arrest, And while Bridges would get into legal proceedings from prison, on the other side, his ex-wife had strangely gotten into a legal battle with her previous employer over her marriage decision. You see, at the time, Ariana was training to become a Maryland state police officer. And while Bridges had been indicted at the time on his initial charge, that academy had a policy that forbid recruits from associating with convicted felons. And while they had initially hinted at the possibility of an exception, when she proceeded with the marriage, they fired her anyway. While the specifics of this case are puzzling, as this wrongful termination suit's outcome doesn't seem to be public, it's at least worth noting that Bridges' actions also had fallout all the way into his personal life. And while that's all that can be said about the first corrupt agent, Karl Mark Force's corruption had a different flavor. Unlike Bridges, whose main strategy was siphoning off Bitcoin through brute access, Karl's methods were more akin to theater, as he would act out scenarios and come up with stories that alternated between helping Ross and attempting to extort him or scam him using his government-sanctioned identity or other usernames that he had constructed on the Silk Road. And while one of these usernames is not like the others, what emerges is a lateral timeline based on Karl's extracurricular activities. Starting with Death from Above, on April 1st, 2013, shortly after Curtis was quote-unquote knocked off, Karl then took it upon himself to create a new username on the Silk Road, where Karl had sent Ross the following message.
I know that you had something to do with Curtis's disappearance and death. Just wanted to let you know I'm coming for you, Took. You are a dead man. Don't think you can elude me. De oppresso liber.
Over the course of the next few days, Karl would send this exact message multiple times through the Silk Road support system. But another message would be sent to Inigo on the 5th of April, 2013.
Indigo, please pass the message to your boss. FBI, DEA, SOCA, AFP can't find you, but don't think for a second that the DOD can't. I just want an explanation. If you didn't do it, then I need you to tell me who did. You don't strike me as the type, but I've seen stranger stuff. If I don't hear from you by this weekend, I fly to Vancouver within the next couple of days.
After Karl's sign-off, Ross seems to be initially off-put, as he's currently preoccupied with the whole Red and White saga during this time. Though, Ross does eventually respond on the 6th of April and state,
I don't know who you are or what your problem is, but let me tell you one thing. I've been busting my ass every goddamn day for over 2 years to make this place what it is. I keep my head down. I don't get involved with the drama, and I do the right thing at every turn. Somehow, that isn't enough. Somehow, psychotic people still turn up at my doorstep. I've been scammed, I've been stolen from, I've been hacked. I've had threats made against the site. I've had threats made against the community. And now, thanks to you, I've had threats made against my life. I know I'm doing a good thing running this site. Your threats and all the other psychos aren't going to deter me. That's all I'll say to you. I won't answer your questions or get sucked into whatever trip you're on. I have much more important things to do. Stop messaging me and go find something else to do.
Now, shortly after, Karl would respond and state,
It's not that easy, Anand. I'm legit, Green Beret, friend of Curtis. I have access to TS/SCI files that the FBI, DEA, AFP, and SOCA would kill for. In fact, this is what I do. Kill. The only thing that I do. Curtis had a lot of faults, but he helped me through a really bad time. I only have one question for you. What did you do with Curtis Green? Tell me the truth and I'll spare you. We, his loved ones, need to know. Don't worry, DOD has no interest in you and your little website. North Korea and Iran are a lot more important. In fact, as far as the Army and Navy are concerned, you are nobody. Petty drug dealer. But Curtis was somebody. So tell me where he is, and we can be done with this. I'm reviewing your file, and you don't fit the profile of a killer. So where is Curtis? I need an answer. I got sidetracked from Vancouver, but I think that I'll go to the North Bay Indian Reservation. Do they have a casino there, Anand?
While Ross would go on to ignore this message further, in the following day, Karl would go on to send another message, detailing the profile of one Anandathavail, where he then attempted to extort DPR using the stocks, soliciting him for some $250,000. Although this first attempt had ultimately failed, it marked the beginning of Karl's foray into his corrupt extracurricular activities. Now, for a bit of context, before Ross was identified as the operator of the Silk Road, the feds had a few suspects. Among them were Mark Karpeles, the CEO of Mt. Gox, as well as Ashley Barr, whom was an employee of Karpeles, where suspicion was derived due to their financial proximity. Given that the Silk Road was the driving force behind Bitcoin's price at the time, the largest exchange had direct crossover in their financials. But while we discussed the circumstances surrounding Mt. Gox in the first episode, there was also another suspect who got dragged into the crosshairs in a completely different way. Now, a large part of the Silk Road's culture was its intertwined libertarian politics. The Silk Road had a book club, and a core part of the public-facing messaging on the Silk Road forum were links to various sites that explained their ideology. One of the websites that Dread Pirate Roberts would often link to was one Mises.org, where they had their own forum, and as a result, the government assumed some link between the two communities, where after a stylometric analysis, the closest user that they had determined was a handle by the name of Liberty Student. This username would be eventually tied to a man by the name of Anand Dothevale. And in layman's terms, all this really meant was that Anand and Ross had some overlap in their writing style, political views, and skill set. But despite surface-level profiling, that didn't stop Carl from attempting to exploit the files he had access to for his own personal gain. On the other end, Ross notes the extortion attempt, though it only served to confuse him. But while we're on the subject of writing styles and stylometry, within the Death from Above chat logs, we also see Carl's apparent tendency to include a sign-off message. As you'll soon see, this will later come back to bite him. But continuing on, given that Carl's initial attempt had failed, in the months that followed, Carl would revert back to his other identity to continue scheming. Fast forward up to June of 2013. As we've established, this is a time period where Ross is starting to feel the heat from the various investigations. But despite the previous mishap with Nob, Ross had still kept in contact in the coming months. As one article from Wired had stated, across the country, Force, the DEA agent, was hoping to capitalize on DPR's difficulties. He told DPR about Kevin, a supposed source of counterintelligence on the growing Silk Road investigation. Nob explained that like all good cartel-affiliated players, he had a, quote, guy on the inside, a dirty Department of Justice employee on his payroll. Kevin, of course, was Force himself, and he had a lot of valuable information for DPR. Force told his supervisors that this informant game would make Nob seem omniscient and therefore more trusted. Citing Kevin, Nob fed DPR intel and predicted busts of Silk Road users and vendors. Things were getting dicey out there, Nob said. He pressed DPR on the need for a 30 seconds flat escape plan, suggesting various itineraries. Indeed, Ross had heeded Nob's warning, as he was not only attempting to attain citizenship in the Dominican Republic, but he had also been attempting to develop a back-end monitoring system for the Silk Road to monitor law enforcement activity. And while the whole Mr. Wonderful ordeal added to his paranoia, for a bit of a fun fact, Ross also had a file on his computer named emergency.txt, which featured an unrealized escape plan that involved Ross getting on a train and starting a new life somewhere else. On the other side of things, as a part of this angle Nob was pitching, this also resulted in a payment of 400 Bitcoin in June of 2013 for a fake passport, and an additional payment of some 525 Bitcoin in August for Kevin's quote-unquote intel. But once again, Ross had gotten burned. Tried to get a fake passport from Nob, but gave a fake pic and effed the whole thing up. Nob got spooked and is barely communicating. Said his informant isn't communicating with him either. As a result, the well had run dry with Nob, where Carl then takes it upon himself to create another username, French Maid. And given Carl's tendency to roleplay, yes, this one is as ridiculous as it sounds. But within his opening message to Silk Road support on August 26, 2013, he forgets to get into character. As the initial message had read, I have important information that you need to know ASAP. Please provide me with your public key for PGP. Carl. In perhaps the largest blunder in Silk Road history, Carl had signed off using his real name, where he then proceeds to play off the mistake in the least suspicious way possible, claiming that he's actually Carla Sophia, and he has many boyfriends and girlfriends on the marketplace. While this screw-up was too large to miss, the corruption continued on anyways, where, notably, their later correspondence is encrypted. Nonetheless, the reason that Carl had been reaching out to Ross in this time was to inform him about a proposed meeting between the Baltimore investigation and Mt. Gox. For a bit more context, earlier in the year, HSI Chicago had urged Baltimore not to pursue the exchange, fearing that Mark Karpeles might have some direct ties to the Silk Road. But in May of 2013, Baltimore had gone after Mt. Gox's US-based subsidiary bank accounts, which caused some tension between the two investigations. While we discussed this earlier when touring through Sean Bridges' corruption, there's actually another angle here with Carl as well. You see, while Mt. Gox was based in Japan, US bank accounts with Douala were still used for bank transfers in the United States. As a result of operating an unlicensed money transmitting business in the US, Karpeles faced charges, where thereafter, as a part of the back and forth between attorneys, this eventually led to a proposed meeting where Karpeles would potentially hand over a new suspect's information. While this idea hung around negotiations until late August, Carl constructed the French-made persona to effectively sell this information right back to Ross. Looking back at the journal, we can see that he agreed to pay some $100,000 for the upcoming intel in September. But here's the kicker. Ross got scammed again, as his notes mention that he never heard back from French-made, and the subject never gets revisited. Now, while it's pretty ridiculous how many times Ross had gotten scammed, from his perspective, this wasn't a case of reckless spending, as at the time, Ross was deeply paranoid about Mt. Gox cooperating with law enforcement, and that paranoia does have a very real source. You see, Silk Road once had a little-known hedging system that let vendors lock in the USD value of the purchase and receive the equivalent in Bitcoin later. This was designed to protect against volatility, but given that the market consistently mirrored the spot price of Mt. Gox, this strongly implied that DPR also managed an account on the exchange to match various orders on the Silk Road in real time. In essence, every time a sale was made on Silk Road, for the system to work, a corresponding sell order on Mt. Gox would be required to lock in the price and effectively hedge the transaction to avoid volatility later. But to not get too technical here, we will circle back to this thread of the story later. But all you need to know for now is that something catastrophic had occurred for Ross in the earlier part of the year, and Mt. Gox was attempting to hand over a key piece of intel regarding this hedging account. Getting back to the documented corruption. While French-made was the final scheme tied to Carl on the Silk Road, this wasn't the end of his corruption overall. If you recall, some $200,000 was tied to Carl during the 2014 Bitstamp seizure. But this wasn't the same $190K that he extorted from Ross. You see, outside his role as the lead undercover, Carl appeared to be quietly trying to cozy up to various Bitcoin exchanges. Between his attempts to add Mark Karpeles on LinkedIn and emails later released by Karpeles himself, Carl was actively trying to establish a working relationship with Mt. Gox. But after being ignored, he seemingly sent a bitter follow-up message to Karpeles, stating, "You should have partnered with me," just days after the exchange's accounts were seized by Baltimore. While this first attempt failed, in late 2013, Carl found his way into another exchange, CoinMarket. There, he positioned himself as both a seed investor and their would-be chief compliance officer. But there was only one major problem. This arrangement posed a clear conflict of interest. So while Carl wasn't formally employed by CoinMarket, unofficially he was a core part of their team. Acting in cooperation, Force effectively sold out his access to law enforcement records for the exchange's benefit. But beyond that, this position also led Carl into enacting his largest theft to date. In February of 2014, Carl was notified about an account holding an unusually large balance at the exchange, belonging to a self-employed actor from California, where court documents only identify them by their initials, RP. Initially, CoinMarket flagged RP's account for potential structuring after a series of $10,000 withdrawals appeared suspicious. After reaching out to Carl for guidance, he responded by claiming that RP was under federal investigation and instructed CoinMarket to freeze his account. However, just days later, the exchange's CEO followed up again to explain that a glitch in their system had prevented users from withdrawing more than $10,000 at a time. But rather than change his opinion, Force doubled down, suggesting that RP might have a mental condition, and continued pushing for the seizure of his money. Deferring to Carl's judgment, CoinMarket complied, where the exchange converted the cash to a certified check for the DEA, but the remaining digital assets, nearly $300K, were quietly funneled into his own personal wallet, where hereafter, some $200K finds its way into his Bitstamp account. While we've come full circle back to Bitstamp, as far as the other money that Carl had acquired, this exchange had been used previously. But Bitstamp wasn't his only attempted off-ramp, as the criminal indictment also details a bizarre incident involving Venmo in February of 2014. Though not stated explicitly, the documents insinuate a transaction where Carl was potentially trading Bitcoin for USD using Venmo as a medium. Predictably, after a $2,500 transaction, both of their accounts are frozen. But rather than cut his losses, Carl pushed back, contacting Venmo and claiming that the transaction was tied to law enforcement activity. He lists his credentials and even goes as far as to solicit Venmo for a potential working relationship. But this didn't work, where he then doubles down and illegally uses his supervisor's signature stamp to forge a DOJ subpoena, pressuring Venmo to unfreeze his account. But this also backfired. When Venmo reached out to verify the subpoena and the request was made back to Carl's superiors, he then scrambles to intercept it and later instructs the company to disregard the subpoena. But once again, he's still not done. Internal records show that by March, Carl had a personal vendetta against Venmo, where he'd been investigating whether or not Venmo was properly registered with state money transmission regulators. Internal correspondence showed that he'd been attempting to target the company's bank accounts for seizure, all over this one little incident. But around the same time, Carl's power trip was in full swing, as he had also entered into a movie rights deal with 20th Century Fox for the Silk Road, worth an estimated $240,000. Details are sparse on this arrangement, as he would later be indicted. But taking a step back for a moment, both agents would ultimately end up behind bars on a range of charges. Carl was sentenced to 6.5 years, though he only served 5.5, and while Sean Bridges received 8, he only served 6. These comparatively light sentences have been a long point of contention, especially when weighed against the double life sentence that Ross had initially received. While much of the controversy surrounding this case has died down in the wake of Ross being released, what is often overlooked in Carl's case was the fact that the prosecution had considered mental illness as a factor in his punishment. Entered into his guilty plea was this exact stipulation, and while on the surface this seems like a cop-out, digging deeper, there are quite a few interesting things to note about Carl's career with the DEA. In 2004, during an undercover assignment in Denver, he was pulled from the field after getting a DUI. In 2008, another undercover role in Puerto Rico triggered a mental breakdown so severe he had to be institutionalized. According to his attorney, Carl had experienced a complete detachment from reality. His reintegration was slow. He wasn't cleared to return to the DEA until 2010, and even then, he was restricted to office duty until 2012, where he's then assigned to the Silk Road case. Furthermore, taking a look at the court docket, we can see Carl's list of medications, which include various medications for anxiety, mood regulation, as well as an antipsychotic. Overall, it's implied by the timeline that this assignment was probably intended as a low-risk re-entry into undercover work, a more controlled environment, rather than putting him right back out in the field. Finally, Carl's attorney cites his father's death in April of 2013 as the catalyst for his mental downward spiral, leading to excessive drinking and erratic behavior in his home life. Notably, we can also see that the account Death from Above was created right around the same time period as Carl's father passing away. While I'm sharing this not to justify the actions of a corrupt federal agent, it certainly adds another layer of storytelling here, knowing the motivations of this character. But all that being said, while the corruption in the Silk Road case is both appalling and extensive, what we've detailed thus far is solely the corruption that was documented.
How I came up on it, I guess at the time I was a regular contributor to the Silk Road forums under the name Oz Freelancer. And like most people, I had a couple of identities on Silk Road, but Oz Freelancer was the one tied to my real world identity. So at the time when Silk Road was still quite in its infancy, I was a journalist and a blogger, and I wrote several features about darknet markets and the dark web for Australian newspapers. And I also kept a blog, allthingsvice.com, that reported more informally about all the goings on the dark web, but especially about Silk Road, because I was absolutely fascinated with the place. I thought it was, it was quite incredible. So I chatted with and interviewed a lot of Silk Road staff and users, and by the end of 2012, I decided to write a book about Silk Road, which the Dread Pirate Roberts was aware of. So this is while Silk Road was still up and running, and he was open to contributing to it, though it never got to that point before he was arrested. But lots of Silk Road members were involved and happy to be interviewed for this particular book. So it's not surprising that in this counter intel document, Alpacino says, look, I know that Eileen is writing a book. Well, that's nothing, that's not intelligence, because pretty much everyone in Silk Road knew I was writing a book. But he also said that it was likely that I was being wiretapped, which, I sort of assumed that might have been happening all the time, but it was interesting to see it in black and white, having confirmed that I wasn't completely paranoid.
Now, to set the stage for the events of late July 2013, a month has passed since the Mr. Wonderful fiasco, and while the smoke is cleared, Ross doesn't realize the damage has already been done. One of his own employees has flipped, and while another has been identified, the head of the Silk Road is still out of reach for investigators. Although the IRS agent Gary Alford had uncovered the Altoid lead back in June of 2013, it wouldn't reach prosecutor Saren Turner's desk or be taken seriously by the FBI team until September. If you recall from the first episode, the username Altoid was the key in linking a digital trail from the first mention of Silk Road online to a Gmail account under Ross's real name. So, come July, while Ross isn't under surveillance during this time, he is starting to feel the pressure, and he's frantically busy. Between working on a back-end monitoring system for Silk Road, coordinating Bitcoin gambling projects with Variety Jones, and trying to launch yet another Bitcoin exchange, he's stretched very thin. We can infer this because Ross doesn't elect to keep his usual notes during this time, and of what notes he does keep, they're stored in a different file, where instead of his usual commentary, we're left with a data dump of messages that comprises the bulk oflecounterintel.txt. Though I should note, throughout these messages, Ross only saves one side of the conversation, the messages that he had received, presumably saved to make sense of later. Though the bulk of the document can be credited to simply two informant relationships, pages 1 to 4 are from a user by the name of East India Trader, while the messages saved on pages 5 to 16 are from Notwonderful, aka Alpacino. All-inclusive, there are a few tidbits found at the end of page 4, though we did discuss the majority of this. So instead, let's first give you the rundown on East India Trader, as he first identifies himself as a former Silk Road vendor who had just spent 6 months in federal custody for Silk Road-related crimes, while he further claims that he's living in a halfway house under DEA supervision. He mentions that he's able to slip away to the library to notify Ross about the ongoing law enforcement activity. From here, he tells Ross that law enforcement is actively trying to infiltrate his site, flipping moderators, bribing vendors, and messaging them individually through Tormail. While he warns that someone from Ross's staff may already be compromised, the majority of the key intel provided lines up with what we already know about Emailgate. And given this fact, this points to EIT having dealt with the Baltimore investigation. To not get too lost in the weeds though, ultimately the purpose of this correspondence is less about counter-intel and more so just a large warning for Ross to flee the country, keep eyes on his staff members, and tighten his operational security, as he claims that the various agencies are, quote, foaming at the mouth to take credit for his arrest. Though we don't have direct access to what Ross had said, by the final message from East India Trader, it's apparent that there's a tone shift as it reads, "Please delete all info, as it's for your safety, not mine. I want nothing from you, and I'm not trying to throw psyops at you. I've always liked the way you ran the community, but I'm no traitor. I respect your progress on this frontier, but I worry about your future, along with the members' futures. If you don't believe me and want to live in denial, go ahead. One day you'll look back and wish you looked further into the rabbit hole." As you can imagine, Ross probably wasn't receptive to this type of informant. Given the fact that they were cooperating with law enforcement, this will obviously bring up some question about their loyalty. On top of that, his vantage point isn't that helpful either. He's not a true insider. He's simply within earshot of the investigation. And taking a look back, the intel provided to Ross is exactly what you'd expect. A mixed bag of true details that are heavily mixed in with rumor. While his warnings are pretty prophetic in hindsight, the lack of clarity included with their intel makes most of it unactionable. For example, while he'll properly warn Ross that someone on his staff might be compromised, he's not able to provide who or how. While he'll randomly instruct Ross to avoid Tor mail altogether, coincidentally, Tor mail will be raided by the FBI just a couple weeks later. Although details weren't publicly disclosed for some time, one journal entry seems to insinuate that his other informant, Alpacino, had provided him with the specifics of this particular takedown. So to summarize, while this individual clearly had some pulse on where law enforcement was directing their attention, ultimately, this informant relationship didn't really make it off the ground. Or at least it appears that way. In hindsight, the details here are largely unknown. But given that they had written that they were in the perfect spot to spy on the DEA, there's only so many cooperating vendors this could have been. Yet, the follow-up here isn't plainly seen at all. Although some documents later surfaced from Ross's defense, claiming that they had identified East India trader, the reference itself is contradictory, as within the same breath, they hedge the claim by stating that it could also be Carl Mark Force. As fate would have it, that name would never be tied to Carl, or anyone else. So while this serves as another loose end, this is sort of understandable, as EIT never seemingly solicited Ross for any money. Without any financial exchange, there's no paper trail to tie to the alias. So while the lack of clarity makes sense here, the same can't be said about the next informant, that being Notwonderful. If we review a later released set of documents from Ross's defense, we learn that this individual had reached out to DPR on the Silk Road forums around July 26, 2013, as this coincides with the first payment Ross had made to this user. Turning back over to page 5 in LE Counter Intel, we find what appears to be the first message, which reads the following.
This is for you only. Try this and I'll explain later why. Message your staff/moderators individually and ask, so, feeling wonderful lately? And then ask, anything you want to tell me? Make sure you use the word wonderful. There's an ongoing effort to engage and coerce your staff into giving up some access/insight/internal communications. Last I hear, there is headway on that. The key points are greed or intimidation. I believe it was someone at the DHS or CBP who wanted to own it, but ultimately it's a DEA gig with a few cooks in the kitchen. We'll absolutely request that you never let on about this, and I'm sure you know how to run your team and what level of trust to repose. But just know that absolutely there's an ongoing dialogue there with a Mr. Wonderful. Shocking, huh? Be smart about that. Know that some of your vendors have been approached for and provided for money by your information. Vendors that get banned are approached via the email addresses they provide on their pages. Just recently, a New York-based pill guy sold his entire customer list to what he thought was Atlantis. Can find out his handle so you can poke around old private messages if need be. There are several uses for databases of buyer information. I'm certain there's not many techies involved due to the unconventional nature of this network and technology. There are not much use for full-time geeks being sourced and assigned anything more than standard workload, unless there's some specific technical question or explanation needed. There are a few different working profiles on you. Can probably get into detail later on how that's culled. The most popular is that you're on the East Coast, live with family, have either quit your office job, or primarily do consulting/contract work from home. There's other stuff I'd rather not get into, but rest assured anything worthwhile or concrete usually makes the rounds as gossip, and there's no real gossip, if that makes any sense. There are really tons of useful nuggets I have to offer, and what my birdie doesn't know, he can probably find out, but no guarantees on the time frame, due to the nature of keeping everything properly insulated. Birdie has to fetch information with proper care. Also, please realize the risk I run and have run. Anything you want to ask?
I should add that by the time Ross would have read this message, the entire Mr. Wonderful situation had come and gone. So, seeing this resurface out of context likely piqued his curiosity. Though we don't have the exact message Ross sent as a follow-up, based on the next messages preserved in the document, we can assume that Ross has sent a numbered list of questions. Something like, number 1, what do you want from me? Number 2, can you prove you're an actual insider? And number 3, why are you helping me?
That I struggled with myself and anticipated. Well, I suppose you have no solid way of knowing. But ponder this. I have no intention of asking you anything whatsoever. There is not a single thing I have any intention or need to ask you. If this is a play to extract information/data out of you, it would be futile, as there's not a single thing I want to know. If you dig around your staff's correspondence, unless already deleted, you will notice I'm right on the money about Mr. Wonderful. I would not be privy to such if I was Joe Blow from nowhere. I can also tell you that one of your guys claimed he's been recycled. That is the exact word. I'm not sure if that's some internal term or it means he/she was from a different role and put into another one. I can assume it means a moderator or administrator was shifted from a previous role into a similar role. If that term recycled means anything to you, then that should at least speak to my legitimacy. Again, you do not have to acknowledge you know what that means. If it makes sense to you, then so be it, and if it doesn't, then I can poke around more. I'm confident that if you re-examine your staff behavior and correspondence, it should verify my solid info. I'm not psychic. I'm not on your staff. Therefore, number 2, if you can come up with a method to verify, I'm not. I'm open to it as long as I'm able to protect myself to the fullest. I'm hesitant to touch any data, but I can and do commit things to memory. There would be no gain in feeding you false information or lying to you. It would not benefit you in any way, and you would realize your time is being wasted, and that would be all she wrote. I think you're intelligent enough to parse BS from fact. Feeding false information would be the goal of someone with the intent of disrupting your activities or hoodwinking you. Again, something you would probably be able to verify. Maybe half a year ago, a guy from Podunk, Virginia, contacted local and was crying about being blackmailed for his personal information by anonymous criminals. Phil something. Middle-aged guy who ran a travel agency. Even down to that level, pops up on the radar, nearby to where the birdie hangs out. Did not take long to assemble the backstory. Small-time recreational buyer just got blackmailed, if you want to call it that, by a crooked vendor, and dismiss as utterly irrelevant. I'm sure old private messages or communications can be examined to verify that instance. How on earth would I be privy to that? And to know hard details? These things make the rounds, believe me. I would only provide you with things that could be of utility. Number 3. In short, I admire what you've created. I don't think for a minute that helping you out time to time would hurt anyone. Might sound hypocritical, but it's not. And personal gain? I don't think you've ever done anything that warrants resources of the state being delegated to interfere. I call a spade, and JTF reports/operational/mindset are all a crock. I don't see anything wrong in what goes on here, and in another less boring life, I'd probably have wished I could have been a part of it. Granted, I'm technically on the other side, on paper, but that's a means to eat. I'm not Snowden by any stretch, but I admire that. I've always tossed around the idea about how cool it would be if someone like the birdie would hook you up here and there. But the horror of getting utterly effed and having my freedom taken would kill any such thoughts. But as I've said, without being arrogant, I know I'm relatively insulated enough by virtue of not being that close anymore. I'm a fly on the wall in the grand scheme of things, and more importantly, personal gain. If you're in a position to potentially augment your means and income, wouldn't you? I make a decent living, but I also have responsibilities and material desires. My conscience is clear because I don't feel like I'm harming a single living creature. I don't come free, so there's that motivation. Worst case scenario, I can provide you with insight and philosophy. Best case, I can provide you with solid action items that would unequivocally give you a competitive edge. I'm not trying to sell my utility to you. I'm pretty sure that's a no-brainer. But I do think I can deliver.
It's apparent that whatever Alpacino said at this point disarmed Ross quite a bit, leading him to seemingly trust him from this point forward. Additionally, while we saw the initial reference to Mr. Wonderful, clearly we see he doesn't stop there, and as you'll notice, it's very interesting that he repeatedly directs Ross towards internal private messages, specifically encouraging him to poke around and verify what's being said. While at first glance this might seem innocuous, I'd also like to point out that it's very strange that Alpacino would know about the, quote, internal recycling of staff, as the only way to know this would be to know that Scout was compromised, yet he leaves that part out. Further insinuating he's not psychic, but it's almost as if he's clairvoyant when it comes to the site's internal communications. Irregardless, the next message includes a negotiation.
I think that works. Initial plus weekly. I'm not entirely sure on what's fair or not fair. Initial retainer, I don't know. 5K too much? Or is 8K too much? I'll let you decide. Weekly, do you want to do 500? Obviously, there's some weeks where there will be nothing major other than chatter, and other weeks where there might be extremely useful intel. I think we can just leave it at 500 weekly. I made an account on your site. Alpacino. Another thing, what I'm doing, despite all precautions, I've thought out all scenarios, could possibly ruin mine and my family life if ever discovered. I implore that you never utter a word to a soul, a partner, a significant other, or even God, if you're religious. I know you take security seriously, and you've demonstrated that, so I know you know where I'm coming from. And if either of us ever wants to cease communication, then that should be an option and understood as a logistical decision, with no hard feelings. Let's operate under your terms, and I will get to work tonight on writing up as much as I can. Responding to your questions, then you can dissect and pick my brain with follow-ups, then I respond, etc. I just have to be careful to walk a fine line that won't identify me or my location. But I've made a decision, and I'm fairly confident in my abilities to satisfy your purposes and cover my ass too. The only condition I have is that nothing I ever say be used in a manner that can harm anyone's safety, even if actual information is provided. For some purposes, a vendor name or location, I would hope that nobody's safety is ever seriously jeopardized. Could not live with that. What you do with information, if it involves threatening or anything, is your business. But nobody can actually be harmed. I don't think you operate that way anyways. I do have to run to dinner, so we'll give you a comprehensive write-up later tonight. And I do respect what SR stands for. In another life, I would have loved to be a part of it. Maybe this is one way to live that fantasy out.
Here we see the inception of the username Alpacino. And to clarify, while Notwonderful seems to be the initial account that this individual had used to first get Ross's attention, the Alpacino account ends up serving as the main username thereafter. But speaking of payments, let me remind you that in this story, nearly everyone was gambling with their freedom in the pursuit of life-changing amounts of money. But strangely, Alpacino sells out his integrity for next to nothing, all while he approaches Ross under the guise of wanting to live out some fantasy. The story presented here is weird, but continuing along with the messages, what follows is a lengthy report where he opens with what reads like a disclaimer. He begins on the condition that Ross can keep no record about what's about to be said. Though from there, Alpacino provides an overview of the various agencies involved in Silk Road, gradually elaborating on their roles and reach, where he then writes,
That should not worry you, because by presence, I only mean that there are active agents and officer-level involvement, whose resources are pooled and budgets are shared. On a limb, I'll say this. Everything having to do with Silk Road, like any investigation, is on shared drives that almost all can read and write to. There's a shared public Outlook folder, where all correspondence is routed. Everybody, and I mean everybody from entry level up to the heavens, has read access. Additionally, people talk a lot. Loose lips is an understatement. And a level of immaturity and juvenile attitude is staggering. There is no such thing as confidential, and this is a culture where people are numb. You must understand that part of why I'm so confident in my ability to maintain this relationship is that nothing is treated as sacred, and there are probably 100 people like me who could offer the same level of access.
As we can see, Alpacino presents himself as, quote, a fly on the wall, someone not directly in the field, but has visibility into the broader operational picture. In theory, this is a great vantage point. Yet as the log continues, he further clarifies that despite the size of the government presence, the agencies are struggling to make any headway.
Yes, you read that right. They're broke and have no concept of tech savvy, and frankly, they're not interested. DEA guys often initiate most chatter having to do with Silk Road, yet follow-up is minimum, and they're too bogged down in pending investigations of subjects whom they have the ability to surveil, and or whose circle they can infiltrate by way of confidential informants, none of which is possible when dealing with a beast that is virtually immune to real-world surveillance. It's not a question of getting warrants to ISPs, it's a question of who or where to begin looking. They're stuck.
From here, he provides specifics on how the Silk Road site is being monitored, where, after a lengthy detail, he provides the law enforcement profile for DPR. Though strangely, it's a mix of vague flattery with sprinkled general details. At one point, he does seemingly mention some of the stylometric phrases that were on record, But notably, we don't see any mention of names like Carpellus or Othervale. As the report continues, we get to Mr. Wonderful again, where he then writes,
"A few of your staff have absolutely been in touch with Mr. Wonderful, and most likely have carried on correspondence with them off-site. Mr. W is being actively maintained by the DEA. Nothing major has come of this as far as I know, but tidbits have made the rounds, such as that there's a fear of you, or you have had asked for personal information in the past to appoint members of staff. Also, that you have recycled staff, which is taken to mean that either Cirrus is Scout, and Libertas could be Nomad Bloodbath. SSBD has also communicated with Mr. W. To what extent exactly, or the nature of their correspondence, I don't know. I could find out, but it would not be immediate, as if it had to be handled with tact. If there was any successful breach of any staff account, it would be known, and I would tell you. There has not been."
Though we see some ambiguity in Alpacino's wording about which staff member was recycled. For context, Libertas, real name Gary Davis, was another administrator who shows up sometime after Nomad disappears. While today we know they weren't the same person, Libertas never spoke to Mr. Wonderful. And on top of that, he further specifies that he's not privy to what SSBD had said to Mr. Wonderful either. So it seems pretty obvious that the only person that could have relayed this information was Scout. But despite heavily insinuating the Scout is still talking to law enforcement, he doesn't label it a breach. Do you see the contradiction here? As earlier, he states one of your guys self-claimed that they were recycled. As to why Ross wouldn't fire them again is beyond me. But as the log continues, Alpacino presents a picture of the future on how he believes Silk Road will be taken down.
When they hit, they will hit several big vendors at once. They will parade them in front of the media and give the impression that the entire Silk Road infrastructure was brought down, a la farmer's market. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, there's nothing cooking at that level currently. Something of that magnitude would be seen coming well in advance, and chatter would ramp up. But there's never been heightened activity of that level, in my birdie's time being a fly on the wall.
Though the idea of one big sweep was very consistent with law enforcement strategy in the years to come, the idea that law enforcement would only target the vendors is just factually inaccurate. Ultimately, it appears as though Alpacino is trying to sell Ross a version of the future that makes his intel the most useful, as at the core of this pitch is the core role that Alpacino will soon play, that being the informant who helps vendors avoid capture, as he's credited multiple times with assisting on this front. And I want you to pay attention to how much he leans into this towards the end of his initial report.
Right now, there's a watch-and-see environment. I don't want to say that the idea is to turn a blind eye by any means, but until they swoop and hit several vendors at once, there is no big fish in the crosshairs. The servers are a mystery, as is the leadership. Going after buyers would do absolutely nothing and not justify the budgets. Going after vendors one at a time also won't sit well, as those just get kicked down the food chain. Going after several vendors at once will be the play. Bet on that. That will require compromising and turning CIs in each vendor's operation or periphery, which is not easy. Also, sustaining a DDoS against Silk Road will not be the play either. I know this for a fact. Let me put this in simple terms. You're winning. They just don't know how to tackle this beast effectively.
Following this initial report, it appears as though Ross had asked another follow-up round of questions, where once again we can make some educated guesses. For the first point, he likely asked about tangential investigations, such as Atlantis or Black Market Reloaded, where Alpacino gives an overview. For questions 2 or 3, these are likely asking on clarity about his level of access, as he replies,
Essentially, yes. I have read permissions and can view documents.
And adds that others are CC'd to the same data. From here, it appears that Ross had asked about the technical side of data collection, possibly regarding how government or third parties were doing it. In number 5, this instance seems to be a direct follow-up on his profile, pressuring him for any concrete names or leads that might have come up. But interestingly, instead of going into the specifics that we know were around, Alpacino provides a firm no with a hefty reassurance, stating,
No, there's never been any names, concrete geography, or associations. Something like that would be a big deal, and not the kind of thing that would be able to keep a mum, even if it was field level. You're too big of a fish for it to be able to remain on the field. The irony is that, although this is your show, the cast is more important to target. That's not to say that you shouldn't take precautions and your security very seriously, but the entire Snowden fiasco has shed some light on what kind of impressive technology is at their disposal.
Anybody can be surveilled at any point, and any enough wide parameters can be set to pick up on even the slightest unique identifier. But again, I can't stress enough, it's not in the budgets. If the spooks ever wanted to find you, that could happen. But they do not and will not. There are no hard or soft leads on you. And I can swear on my children to that. If there ever were, I'd know about it. As per our arrangement, you would. But if you continue your standard operating procedures in regards to security, you're a ghost. It is believed that you are the same since the beginning, and that ownership or administration has never changed hands. But you can sleep knowing that you are as known today as you were 2 years ago. Unknown. The door will not just be kicked in like that. There will be a flurry of activity for weeks and months beforehand. A flurry that no birdie will not be able to notice. Don't take that to mean that you shouldn't have several outs and exits, which I'm sure you do. This is not my place to say this, but if I can venture some advice, walk away from this one day. You've done something remarkable that will go down in the history books. But you are human, and humans are prone to mistakes. Any kind of mistake in your position would be catastrophic.
As you can see, Alpacino lays out this continual stream of flattery and reassurance. Though, in question 6, he seems to be inquiring about the ongoing DDoS attacks he's receiving. 7 likely pertains to some sort of academic paper. Skipping down to point 8, we're met with some actual hard intel. That being a list of names where it seems as though Ross had asked which vendors are currently being monitored. Admittedly, it's hard to find further info on some of these names. The username Underground Syndicate does give us a thread to pull on, as this individual does have a later indictment tied to them, showing that they had been acting as a redistributor for another prolific vendor, Supertrips, real name Jan Slomp. You see, Slomp was a part of a larger network based in the Netherlands, where he's later arrested in Florida. This is too specific, so it's apparent that the intel being shared here was likely genuine. But following this, DPR reverts back to being suspicious, where I'm assuming Ross said something like, "You're giving me 2 scenarios here. You're playing some game with me," or the alternative for scenario number 2 is, "You have limited visibility and you're probably not that useful." Though obviously I'm speculating, Alpacino's response is,
"I'm sorry if I said anything that makes you unhappy. I would not lie to you about anything. I would not gain anything from withholding. Rather, you'd lose your utility for me, and obviously that's counter to me even reaching out. Please understand that it's obviously possible that I'm not privy to everything that goes on. I work in a 9-to-5 environment, and I'm nowhere near the field. If there's something that you're 99.9% sure is on DPR's profile, then you'd know better. If I don't know about it, or have not heard or seen it, then that's a limitation of what I'm privy to. And I apologize for that sincerely, because I have no control over that. Re your scenarios, I've reached out to you for, as I said, personal gain. There is no card being played. Believe me, I'm not in the game. To placate you a false sense of security, but then ask for compensation? That doesn't make sense. I see what you're saying, and I don't blame you. But if that scenario had any merit, why would I compromise the Mr. Wonderful deal? Do you see what I'm saying? Scenario 2 is that I'm wholeheartedly, well, heavy-heartedly willing to accept. I do concede that I'm not an agent. I'm not operational. I'm not field. I'm a worker bee. And I do feel useful. And I'm willing to prove it, while also covering my own ass. But if you feel that I'm not as useful as you'd hoped, I'm pretty damn sorry, and I can accept that. I'm open to whatever you suggest.
The reasoning here is pretty crazy. Alpacino leans on this open self-interest angle, as if admitting he's corrupt somehow makes him more trustworthy. But as the conversation plays out, it appears as though Ross later pushes for some actual copies of the case material, where we see some initial reluctance.
There are a few shared drives, but the lion's share of Silk Road-related data is dumped to a drive titled, I'm not kidding, Silk. I would say SR-related maybe 3 gigabytes. As for getting a copy, this is scary. I don't know how, when, or if such a thing would be audited. Do you know? I'll research. But the thought of making a copy of all the folders onto an external from my workstation, that really turns in my stomach. What if there's a system-wide audit of who copied, moved, read, wrote, what folders and files, and asked me what I was doing copying that entire folder to a USB? We're talking do not pass go, do not collect $200 straight to prison. But maybe I'm being paranoid as well, because there are so many cooks in the kitchen, and people move folders and files all the time. No cameras where any of the cubes are, so theoretically, if I found an open workstation, a copy might be possible, but I can tell you that the risks involved are unquantifiable. I can think this one through, maybe copy some docs at a time, or in 2 or 3 passes. Let me read up on how and what can be audited.
Continuing through the final pages of LE Counter Intel, what's outlined is a slow burn plan to send Ross the actual case material, where it was to be delivered encrypted to his Tor mail account. While it doesn't appear as though Ross had any of these files lingering on his computer, recall that he will later lose access when this gets raided by the FBI. So, sticking with what the final messages do show, most of it is Alpacino just providing further advice, such as a suggestion to continue the forward-facing psyops on the forum, or the instruction to assume that his staff is compromised, but to not confront them on it. Rather, use it as an opportunity to feed the feds disinformation. Though he also includes another suggestion to assume that any journalists involved are wiretapped. Ultimately, the final message present in the document is Alpacino thanking Ross for paying his initial retainer, where we're left with a pretty clear picture of an ongoing informant relationship. Based on payment records, Ross kept paying Alpacino right up until the very week that he was arrested, and that's what makes his character so difficult to brush off. Because within the grand scheme of things, the story changes drastically once you realize that Ross was operating under the assumption that he would have some sort of advanced warning to get out. But when the time came, Alpacino never seemingly delivers. And sure, while you might first write this off as simple ignorance, Alpacino did claim to be a fly on the wall, perhaps not privy to the goings-on of the FBI division, where we know that the team there kept things on a need-to-know basis as a way of getting credit first. But here's the thing. As you follow Alpacino's story further, it becomes brutally apparent that something else played out that goes beyond the official narrative.
The FBI says Benthal, who went by the online name DEFCON, was running Silk Road 2.0 since last December. Now, the criminal complaint says Silk Road 2.0 has been used by thousands of drug dealers and unlawful vendors to distribute hundreds of kilograms of illegal drugs and other illicit goods and services.
In the months following the first Silk Road seizure, former staff collected together to rebuild the site. Gathered by the user named Saint Exo, real name Thomas White, he then assumes the role of DPR 2.0. Though as fate would have it, this position would be short-lived. You see, at the time, it was unknown if Ross's laptop was encrypted, as much of the details hadn't made it out to the public yet. So, while the site ran as normal for a bit, come the 19th of December, 2013, a wave of arrests had finally hit, where the only person who was left standing from the former staff was Cirrus. Following this emergency, Thomas White relinquishes ownership, resulting in a contingency plan placing a new head of Silk Road, DEFCON, real name Blake Benthal, as the new head of administration, where as a result, DEFCON had sought out additional help from other users in the community, that being Dr. Clue, real name Brian Farrell, along with a few others at the new core team. Though we discussed the story of Silk Road 2.0 in a previous episode, underneath the main story, there's this lateral assistance from a familiar individual. You see, it appears as though Alpacino had moved over immediately from 1.0 to 2.0 under the name Oracle. As he shows up on the scene, Oracle claims to be in discussions with the new stakeholders of Silk Road, essentially sat at the table with them rebuilding it, where it had become common knowledge within the community that Oracle was once close with Ross. This association immediately buys him credibility, and as you can imagine, in the wake of Ross's arrest, the forums were filled with plenty of arguments about the future of Silk Road. But Oracle acts as this insider who consistently vouches for the new DPR in order to smooth over the transition. Going forward, you can think of Oracle as filling two distinct roles. The first is that of an unofficial spokesman for the staff, relaying updates to the broader Silk Road 2.0 community. And second, he also takes on this role as the head of narrative control, or psychological operations, as he will later admit to being paid to spread disinformation on behalf of the staff. Although this predictably tanks their credibility with the overall community, it's only after Silk Road 2.0's closure that we get some more info on the full scope of their role with the staff.
Last week, the public learned how 2 U.S. law enforcement agents allegedly made hundreds of thousands of dollars on the digital black market Silk Road, while simultaneously working to take down the site. One of the officers, Carl Mark Force, is also being charged as acting as a paid double agent by providing information obtained in his position as a Drug Enforcement Administration agent to the Silk Road's owner. It now seems that Silk Road 2, the site that was set up just weeks after the original, may have also had a similar arrangement, either with Force or another law enforcement informant who was leaking information to the black market's operators. Motherboard interviewed 2 Silk Road 2 staff members who independently claimed the existence of such an informant. This informant was paid $500 a week. The arrangement began in November of 2013, just after the original Silk Road was shut down. Both staffers claim their informant was the same source the original Silk Road enjoyed before it got busted. He missed the extra income, Silk Road 2 moderator Dr. Clue told Motherboard. Before he was arrested in January of this year, only reason he approached us, after Silk Road was shut down by the FBI in October of 2013, it didn't take long for users to begin rebuilding the site. According to a source who had admin access and dealt with customer support on Silk Road 2, the staff of the second site was approached before its launch by an individual with the moniker Lone Wolf, who claimed to have information from law enforcement. When a Lone Wolf asked for too much money, somewhere in the region of a few $1,000s, another pseudonymous user reached out to the staff. This user, called Oracle, said she was a consultant and friend of Ross. According to one of the Silk Road 2 staffers, Oracle claimed to be a woman. She said that she was working for the DEA as a Spanish-English translator. According to one of the Silk Road 2 staffers, those who have been following the story of Silk Road 2 may be familiar with the name Oracle. This user had a habit of appearing at times of crisis and confusion on the site's forums, and in June of 2014, a long, rambling memoir was written by her and republished on the news site Deep.web. In that post, Oracle said she was paid by Dread Pirate Roberts 2 to spread disinformation and also claimed to have intimate knowledge of some of the backstage workings of the marketplace. The tips from Oracle, according to the Silk Road staffer, were mostly to do with arrests. When the prolific drug dealer Supertrips was busted, the administrators of both the original Silk Road and Silk Road 2 claimed to know about it long before it went public.
Now, as the article stated, Oracle had a very distinct pattern of popping up whenever the forums were in an uproar, where he'd either calm everyone down or steer the chaos in a specific direction. Though initially he pops up publicly during the initial transition, he also pops up after the various staff members were arrested. But perhaps the most interesting to me was when Silk Road 2.0 got hacked. In this case, he posted a fake dox of a hacker, which sent people into a frenzy trying to chase this lead down. This is really interesting to me because we know Oracle was a corrupt member of law enforcement. So as to why this person is running cover for whoever stole the money is beyond me. Though they later claimed in their memoirs that they were paid to spread the set of disinformation to distract from the staff's incompetence. To date, none of the money hacked from Silk Road 2.0 has ever seemingly been recovered. And that's not even bringing up the other 3,000 Bitcoin that was stolen in September, right under the noses of the FBI, where they had basically been in their final stages of the takedown. Though this is not to say I'm suspicious of further corruption, but it's always been weird to me how there was never any follow-up on these hacks, considering how most of the money funneled into popular exchanges with very little mixing. And some $44 million is just still sitting dormant, just a few hops away from their original addresses. So while there's very little clarity here, taking a step back, the false docs and random psyops to sow confusion are straight out of the Alpacino playbook, as effectively this was the same type of thing that he was advising Ross on within his initial messages. But with that context out of the way, we know as well from statements from staff that Oracle's intel at some point began to dry up, where it appears they had split ways sometime in mid-2014. But weirdly, this is a bit convenient, as this fallout overlaps with the exact window where the FBI shifts tactics and begins attacking the Tor network to de-anonymize users. Though we discussed the full scope of this in a previous episode, this was also known as Operation Onimus, where for all intents and purposes, this was the big sweep that Alpacino alluded to earlier. But instead of scooping up vendors en masse, the target was Tor service administrators. And if you remember from that episode, one of the main psychological aspects of the Fed staging such a sweeping, highly public takedown was to give the perception that they'd cracked Tor itself. So I'll say this again, how does Alpacino's intel magically dry up at a time where perhaps the largest law enforcement effort to date was ramping up? Aside from the direct claim that Oracle was the same informant that Ross had, the pattern is next to identical. Same modest salary, same kind of insider intel, same writing style, which includes some pretty noticeable idiosyncrasies, and the same skill sets involved in helping construct psyops, where like clockwork the pattern repeats. In both markets, Alpacino is somehow able to provide early warnings when it comes to vendor arrests, but somehow fades out of the picture entirely as soon as the fix is in. Though it's hard to say whether Alpacino continued collecting his paycheck within future markets. generally past behavior is indicative of a larger pattern. You see, like I said before, one of the usernames tied to Carl was not like the others, and that user was Alpacino. Though it's apparent through the court filings up until 2015 that Alpacino was suspected to be associated with Carl. This is where that letter that we set aside all the way back comes relevant. To reiterate, this was originally sent to Ross's judge, filed under seal in 2014. Authored by the New York prosecutor Sharon Turner, this was sent to Judge Forrest to keep her informed about the parallel San Francisco corruption investigation into Forrest and Bridges. Although these things were handled separately, they were still informed about the goings-on, as one relevant section read,
Special Agent Force is also being investigated for leaking investigative information to Ulbricht through a different Silk Road username, Alpacino. A file recovered from Ulbricht's laptop titled LE Counterintel contains extensive records of communications that appear to be under the heading Correspondence with Alpacino. The communications purport to be from someone claiming to be, quote, in the perfect spot to play spy for Silk Road with the DEA. Like the correspondence from French Maid, these communications reflect inside knowledge of USAO Baltimore's investigation of Silk Road. Further evidence indicates that Ulbricht paid Alpacino a salary of $500 per week to supply such information. Accordingly, USAO San Francisco is investigating whether Special Agent Force controlled this username as well and exploited it to exchange investigative information to Ulbricht for payment in bitcoins.
Now, I should note that it's apparent that this letter reflects an early state in the investigation, as this section wrongly misattributes a quote from East India Trader. Though this is besides the point, the early statement here does confirm that authentic insider material was contained. But here's the thing. When they finally released their criminal complaint in May of 2015, detailing the corruption by the two corrupt agents, the name Alpacino never gets any further acknowledgement. Although the 2015 San Francisco complaint still randomly cites LE Counterintel as authentic insider material, the passing mention makes no sense, as they never meaningfully connect the file to either of the corrupt agents. To put it simply, if the government had found out that it was Carl, they would have charged him on top of everything else. But they didn't, despite that early letter indicating that they were planning to. So, at some point, something changed. Something stopped them from prosecuting what was, by all available evidence, the longest-running corrupt informant relationship in the Silk Road's history, where this obviously begs the question as to what happened. As fate would have it, the only follow-up we would receive would be that the evidence surrounding this individual had been covered up, as come 2016, it was later discovered that someone, somehow, managed to delete nearly all traces of their existence out of the Silk Road files. To set the stage, after Ross's conviction, come 2016, his legal team was knee-deep in the middle of their appeals, where as a part of their efforts to keep the Silk Road story in the limelight, Joshua Draytell, Ross's attorney, held a press conference centered squarely on this issue. According to them, they had uncovered evidence of the aforementioned, where alongside their conference, they also released a set of documents as a walkthrough. Now, if you watched the first episode, you already know that I'm someone who, in the past, has pushed back on a lot of the narratives coming out of Ross's camp, as they have this habit of taking true evidence from the case, but framing it in their own way. While they obviously do a similar thing here too, the data anomaly they reference, which underpins all of this, is quite the bombshell. For context, when law enforcement seizes digital evidence, they create bit-for-bit forensic images. In essence, they are exact replicas that preserve the full contents and structure of the device, whether it's a server, laptop, or external drive. These images can be admissible in court, but this comes with a broader discussion of chain of custody and authenticity. To ensure their integrity, multiple copies can be made for redundancy, but even before investigators are allowed to comb through any data, it's generally standard procedure to make a separate working copy before they touch anything. As far as the Silk Road servers go, if there's something I didn't fully explain in our first episode, it's that the Silk Road actually had two separate servers. While the primary live one was located in Iceland, there was actually a second backup server located in Philadelphia that was hosted by a company called JTAN. Though a small footnote in the grand scheme of things, the function here is self-explanatory, as it would back up data from the main server on a regular basis. In total, the government provided the defense with 4 separate images. The first 3 were from the backup server, imaged on September 8th, 9th, and October 2nd, respectively. The fourth and final image, taken from the live Icelandic server, was imaged on November 22nd, after Ross was in custody. When it came to these images, the first 3 all shared one glaring anomaly. They were missing all of the forum messages after July 22, 2013, right around the same time that Alpacino had first approached Ross. The final image appeared normal at first. It contained what appeared to be a complete forum archive, spanning from 2011 to 2013. But upon closer inspection, Ross's legal team uncovered something unexpected. A nondescript subdirectory, simply labeled S. Inside it, there was another backup copy of the forum database, where they note this is a non-standard location, as the folder was likely created by the site's lead developer, Smedley, on August 15, 2013, when he had been doing some maintenance. While this subdirectory included an additional set of data, it was nearly identical to the main set, but they noticed one distinct difference. The S version of the forum data also contained forum messages between Ross and Alpacino, which weren't contained in any of the other sets of data. Though no other user data was reported to have been inconsistent, this still very plainly appears as though someone had attempted to delete Alpacino out of existence, only to miss this one last folder. Despite these messages being encrypted, they clarify the ability to decrypt them, presumably with a key found on the laptop. Rounding off this document, they push the utterly ridiculous claim that this evidence showed that the real DPR had inside sources with law enforcement and had escaped to frame Ross. It goes without saying that this makes absolutely no sense once you've looked through all the other data on the laptop, as this is the very same location that we learned about Alpacino in the first place. But setting that aside, what they do show is actually incredibly interesting, as this still doesn't account for all of the messages sent within the final days of the Silk Road's existence, as we're met with this cutoff point after August 15th. So while they failed to cover up everything, it's quite convenient that there was never any follow-up on Alpacino, as any legal recognition of the deleted data would also mean simultaneously acknowledging the server's forensic chain had a break. Though in Ross's case, most of the evidence used to convict him was found on his laptop, I can't imagine a scenario where this wouldn't have at least complicated things legally in some way, given all the cases this data is attached to. And aside from that, what makes the deletions here so crazy is the fact that it completely undermines the narrative that Alpacino was simply a fly on the wall. Just based on the messages we read, if this individual knew the servers were compromised, the selective info fed to Ross feels more like a deliberate play to lull him into a false sense of security. But to follow that up, I spoke to an expert while researching this video, and one point they made was that a cleanup like this is basically impossible after the server is imaged, because the image would preserve the state of the disk, and any post-imaging edits would stick out as obvious tampering. In other words, the prime suspects here are the individuals who had access to the data before the snapshot, or alternatively, whoever handled and prepared the images for investigators. In any event, the main division that had such capabilities would be the FBI CY2 team, which had the case lead, Special Agent Christopher Tarbell. Yet, despite the members of CY2 having done various podcasts in the years after, I've never seen any later acknowledgement of the allegations made by Ross's defense. Though this is not to say I would expect Christopher Tarbell to address this directly, but rather, across the board, there's seemingly been no follow-up on the deleted data at all.
Early in the summer of 2013, after nearly a year of trying to crack the inner workings of the Silk Road website, agents in the FBI's New York cyber branch finally got a break. They noticed a coding error on the site.
They were able to actually find vulnerabilities in the website where they saw it actually leaking its IP address.
It would be a game changer. Investigators discovered the location of the server hosting the website. Agents flew to Iceland, but didn't take the actual server, not wanting to raise the suspicion of Dread Pirate Roberts. Instead, they made a mirror image copy they could work from.
Once we got that server, now we could really dig in and do the investigative type of work that the FBI is known to do. The biggest thing that we got was just an understanding of the volume of activity that was happening on Silk Road. It was just immense.
It gave us insight as to how many people were on the site, what kinds of private messages were being shared.
Everything was out in the open. It was almost like someone saying the odds of anyone getting in here are low, but if they get in here, I'm done.
Agents could even see records of some of Dread Pirate Roberts' own activities.
Who's logging in and who's logging out, who's using the administrative console, meaning who was actually operating the site.
That led them to an internet cafe in San Francisco.
The person that was signing in, the name was crossed.
Officially, the story does end with the discovery of the selective deletions, and I was wondering if I could reach out to anyone to see if they had any further information. Naturally, I had recalled that Alpacino had made a direct reference to the journalist Eileen Ormsby, and as you may have already noticed, there have been sound bites from her throughout this video. Coincidentally, Eileen and I have crossed paths on topics over the years. And while I can't recommend her books enough when it comes to anything Darknet related, outside of her background in being a journalist, her move into specialized coverage originates from her being one of the early individuals following the Silk Road story, where she embedded herself into the community and was openly writing a book asking for contributions from active users. This is what Alpacino was referencing. But since then, she's been all around the world to attend the various trials of individuals and spoken to basically everyone throughout the years. All this to say, if anyone knew what happened to Alpacino, it would be her.
Look, well, honestly, I don't know who Alpacino or Mr. Wonderful is. It was originally assumed that it was another one of the pseudonyms of Karl Marx Force, but that was quietly dropped after a while when it was determined that he wasn't Karl Marx Force. And I don't know if he was also communicating under another name. You know, good chance that he was, especially once he started giving intel to the Dread Pirate Roberts. I imagine he may well have contacted me under one of his other pseudonyms. Certainly I got contacted with my own sort of intel. It was very much along these lines. I think I put it in my blog somewhere.
For context, Eileen wrote that she'd received a tip from an anonymous user right after Silk Road was taken down, though the message offered up the Alpacino thread before it was known. At the time, she wrote it off as a rumor.
You know, is there some trepidation for law enforcement to kind of open this can of worms, you think, when it comes to this person potentially deleting their traces?
The idea that someone was able to do that is quite mind-blowing. Is able to expunge that from all the backups and all the copies is quite astonishing. Also, what I wonder is whether he was doing this in plain text or whether Ross copied and pasted in plain text, because this guy obviously knew computers and was pretty paranoid. He's often said this would destroy me if it ever got out. So you would assume that he was using the most basic protection we have, which is PGP encryption. So I do wonder whether he was actually using that and then Ross was just copying and pasting it in plain text, because I know I used to write to him in PGP and he would write back in plain text, which I'd always thought was insane.
The amount of effort, we were talking about systematically deleting this while you have all of your coworkers potentially monitoring this Dropbox or wherever the evidence is being held in a government data center, which I'm assuming have records. The fact that someone was able to do all of this, and only for such a small amount of money. He's a corrupt DEA agent, but he doesn't fit the boxes of your typical corrupt DEA agent. Does that make sense?
The other theory that I had was, and it's just a theory of, when we're spitballing what could have been, is it wasn't a corrupt DEA agent at all, but it was actually someone who was maybe not authorised to do this in particular, but authorised but going outside their authority, if you know what I mean, which is something that law enforcement agents do all the time, especially if, and it's very, very murky timeline, but if the Mr. Wonderful thing being done by Baltimore was messing up so that it wasn't even a corrupt agent, but just someone that was trying a different approach to see, what they could get out of that as well.
You're saying like this was like kind of an op?
I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm saying that is one option.
Now, for clarity, we know for a fact that Alpacino wasn't DEA because Baltimore never had access to the servers. While this also rules out any possibility that this person was Carl, to better elaborate on what we're discussing, it's important that I outline the plays we've seen thus far. You see, for someone like Scout, we'd classify them as a standard flip, as they're caught and forced to defect to the other side. On the other hand, people like Force and Bridges would fit the profile of rogue agents, individuals who are playing both sides for their own financial benefit. Having established these two, I'd like to introduce you to a more obscure third, what's known as a dangle, where the textbook definition is a person controlled by one intelligence service who's made to appear as a lucrative and exploitable target to an opposing intelligence service. Espionage context aside, this play occurs when one side throws this person at the other, pretending to defect, hoping they'll bite and try to recruit them. If the other side takes the bait, generally there's a number of specific use cases, such as wasting time, money, manpower, feeding disinformation, figuring out what info they want, or even flooding the channel so any genuine leaks from your side get buried. As the article continues, the first three activities are what traditionally drive dangle programs, but some of these opportunities offer even more than immediately meets the eye. For example, learning a target service's collection requirements not only provides a list of what the service wants to know, but also can suggest to a canny CI analyst what the service might know already. And in the case of dangles being run to occupy the target service in useless activity, a potential collateral result might be a false sense of complacency within the target service, driven by the false belief that it's running enough productive agents at a given time. To put it simply, the article is saying that dangles have a potential side effect, instilling a false sense of security. And of course they do. If you present a person as an irresistible target, then get the other side to invest, you've effectively gained a steering wheel of influence. From there, you can funnel info that shapes their beliefs, which in turn shapes their actions, and ultimately, their destination. But to explain the parallels further, dangles rely on what's known as feed information, also known as chicken feed. In plain English, this is real intel that builds credibility, but it's carefully curated, so it doesn't actually harm the goals of the side leaking it. In practical terms, it's usually stale, low stakes, or strategically incomplete. Coming back to LE counter intel, the Mr. Wonderful operation, come July, is stale intel. It's a dead-end lateral effort from a separate investigation, where from there he piles on a whole slew of details. And while a lot of those details are broadly true, Alpacino says a lot without saying anything. The only live intel he provides is vendor-focused, where Ross even credits him with helping vendors avoid capture. As a result, he seemingly buys into the vendor angle. He reaches out to some, and in the journal, he also notes cooperation from a user named Nod, not to be confused with Knob, real name Steven Sadler, a Bellevue vendor who will later go down in a Seattle case stemming from separate efforts by the HSI. So as a result, it's apparent that within the final months of the site's existence, Ross is chasing leads that feel connected to Silk Road, while completely ignoring the primary investigations targeting his internal infrastructure. And that's the core trip-up at the heart of Alpacino's Gambit. This isn't how a normal leak behaves. A genuinely corrupt official sells what their side knows, but instead, this guy fronts as someone tied to the DEA, but is seemingly actually tied to the FBI, almost as if he's using the other investigations as fodder. Now, I can't say all of this with certainty, as the full scope of their relationship isn't known. But the footprint in the data matches the dangle scenario better than most alternatives. It explains why he asked for such little money, why he offers no competitive edge in both markets, and historically, dangles are frequently known to approach the other side on ideological pretenses. And while I don't necessarily think that Alpacino had the word dangle sitting in the back of his head, I'm just drawing your attention to a simpler idea. If it walks like a duck, acts like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's hard to ignore what it resembles. On top of that, what Eileen touched on does make a lot of sense. A law enforcement effort playing out of bounds is a good description. Perhaps also attempting to cripple Baltimore as a way of preventing them from getting in the way in the future, just as they had previously done with Scout's forum account. Yet, to speculate a bit here, I still can't make sense of how Alpacino managed to surgically remove his name from the server data, but not the laptop. And it's especially strange to see such a high-risk cleanup tied to what seems like such a minor payoff. It's almost as if whatever truly warranted the deletion is the part that we're not seeing. And that leaves a larger question hanging over the case. What else happened between them in those final days? Now, to fully understand what I'm implying with that question, I want to walk you through another viewpoint worth considering. You see, we haven't really established whether Alpacino deleted himself out of the files, or whether it was covered up with broader knowledge. And you see, one thing that's really difficult to reconcile about the dangle idea is that $500 a week makes very little sense when discussing a rogue actor, but it does make sense within the confines of an operation, as money isn't the goal. But interestingly, I did later come across a 2020 DOJ audit on the FBI's strategy for Darknet enforcement. Within this document, they identify the role of an OCE, an online covert employee, who are FBI personnel who carry out undercover operations. Here, they explicitly state that they construct or assume online personas to interact with users in order to gather information on a subject or build credibility. Now, to be clear, this audit does not cover the original Silk Road investigation. It covers the years immediately after. But it's still relevant because it shows that similar methods are documented within the FBI in subsequent markets. As I stated previously, a dangle is essentially an informant relationship based on feed information, which is by definition used to build credibility. But moving past that, there's also the initial condition that Alpacino sets on the relationship, that nobody could be harmed as a direct result of his intel. On one hand, maybe Alpacino just genuinely cared about safety, but the weird part is the specific causal boundary. Threats are fine, but the hard line is the actual harm. This feels a lot less like a moral framework and more like a legal liability framework, which is once again inconsistent with a rogue actor. To understand where I'm getting this, the policy governing these things are laid out in the Domestic Investigations and Operations Guidebook, or DIOG. And under the FBI's otherwise illegal activity framework, undercover personnel can be authorized to break many laws for the sake of an operation. In theory, much of what we see Alpacino doing could fall in line with that kind of authorization, but one thing that can never be authorized is violence. In fact, this is the first risk that's considered when getting an approval for an undercover operation. And while we can't prove that Alpacino was sanctioned, when you factor everything together, I do get a greater impression that he may have been on the books, at least at the start. And if this was true, at any point you're looking at a broader cover-up. Perhaps not the entire division, but someone would have had to approve it, supervise it, or at least know it existed. The crazy part is that it's well understood that undercover work can be messy. Operations can have their boundaries changed based on the circumstances. On top of that, sometimes these things can be even redacted in court under a sensitive methodology redaction. But despite all of this flexibility, we don't see any of that here in this case. And another thing that would never be authorized is deleting evidence. So if the decision wasn't to terminate the operation, account for it, or even redact it, the fact that this was deleted suggests something far more serious that isn't seen. Given the lack of any public acknowledgement from anyone, I wanted to see if I could get someone from CY2 to address it directly, if only to at least have some understanding on how this was overlooked. As a result, I reached out to the former FBI Special Agent Vincen't D'Agostino, who served on both the Silk Road 1.0 and 2.0 case. Though he and I spoke over the phone, he agreed to provide a written interview for this episode, which I will include in full linked below. But for reference, his background originates from organized crime, where he was an FBI Special Agent from 2004 to 2015. After the first 8 years, he's credited with over 200 indictments across 9 trials in the FBI's efforts to dismantle the Colombo crime family, though he notes that he later transitioned into the cyber division in 2012. In his own words,
"Shortly after Ross Ulbricht was arrested, I became the trial agent for the Silk Road 1 case, and after the Silk Road 2 site went up, the case agent for that case. It was the first time I was heavily involved with a federal trial I hadn't participated in during the investigation phase. The original investigating agents and computer scientist for SR1 had resigned shortly after the arrest to pursue opportunities in the private sector, so I became the FBI's point person for the trial. I worked closely with the Southern District of New York, helping provide evidence, interview witnesses, prepare for trial, testify, and help prosecutors handle all the not-so-fun stuff that is necessary for a conviction. Given my background, it was a natural fit. FBI trials are rare, as 90% of the cases bled out, and FBI cyber trials were even rarer in 2013, so I was looking forward to the experience."
Now, obviously, the first thing that jumped out at me was how many people left shortly after Ross's arrest. Though that doesn't necessarily mean anything nefarious, it does at least create some distance between the investigation and the prosecution. But beyond that, this was part of a much broader trend. Silk Road sat at the leading edge of a growing demand for cyber and crypto expertise as an increasingly lucrative skill outside of government. Many left the FBI New York office specifically as law enforcement struggled to play catch-up and the private sector was rushing in to build the tools and services needed to meet that demand. All this to say, while these departures were not out of the ordinary, it does at least create a situation where people moved on quickly. Yet, coming back to our interview, when I asked about Alpacino directly, he stated,
"It rang a bell. It has been over a decade since the trial. I recall there was some belief that it might have been another account used by a law enforcement officer, but since it was not used at trial, we did not focus on it, which may seem odd to outsiders, but when working on a case, you're focusing on evidence which points to a suspect's guilt or innocence. Ross being extorted only showed us he was in control. Finding out who this person was, post-Ulbricht arrest, was not a top priority. More important for us to identify people who knew Ross in real life, who also knew he was DPR, or witnesses that could describe for the jury how the site operated."
This statement here does at least confirm Alpacino's presence within the data was known without the full clarity of the deletions. But honing in on the anomaly itself, he later clarified in our messages that the FBI's CART team would generally be the one handling that kind of work, though he does note in our interview that errors can sometimes occur in forensic images. If this happened once, you could maybe write it off as a coincidence, but when that same relative chunk of data is missing across 4 separate snapshots, that's where things start to look more deliberate, at least in my opinion. Though he didn't speculate much about Alpacino's identity across the board. When I asked about the overlap between agencies, he said,
"People need to understand that different federal law enforcement agencies can open investigations on the same subjects or entities independently. While we try to deconflict, that's not always possible. When I worked for organized crime, many of my targets were also DEA targets. They wanted someone for substance, I wanted him for his role in the Colombo family. So who wins? It's not simple. With Tor Hidden Services, it's even more complicated. A federal agency does not need physical presence, just technical presence. Many agencies were investigating Silk Road 1. FBI New York did not trust the others, and now we know for good reason. The SR1 investigation was kept close to the vest and handled by a small group from HSI, IRS, and FBI New York. When the true IP address of the Marketplace Forum was discovered, it was not shared with anyone. There was no indication that any other agency was even close to identifying the true IP addresses or the real identity of Dread Pirate Roberts."
Though, once again, we see how tightly knit the group was with access to the data. By the end of our conversation, one thing was sort of clear to me. If anyone was positioned to fully pursue the misconduct angle, it would have almost certainly been the San Francisco office, as they were the ones who dropped it after all. On that front, DeAgostino suggested I reach out to Catherine Howne, the prosecutor who handled the Silk Road corruption. Yet, this is where I hit a dead end. Despite multiple emails asking why this lead was dropped, I never heard anything back. Like the others, she's moved on to the private sector and now sits at the helm of a crypto hedge fund. And what later stood out to me was that this was the same prosecutor I quoted earlier, the one that implied to Vice that there had been a lot of weird but not necessarily chargeable stuff in the Silk Road files. So while I can only assume that Alpacino later fell into that same bucket, you'd think the discovery of those deletions would have created a very narrow list of suspects. While chargeable is perhaps a different debate, from the outside this doesn't look good. Ross's defense seemingly stumbled across the anomaly by accident, and if the people who weren't even looking for it could find it, it raises the question of why those who were specifically investigating Alpacino didn't say a word. Because at that point, the most charitable explanation is that they didn't take a critical look at the data. A less charitable one is that they did find it and simply didn't like where it led. But while I obviously can't speak for them, it is certainly true that there are a lot of loose ends in the Silk Road data. But I definitely regard Alpacino as perhaps the most bizarre presence in the files. Nothing about this persona really makes any sense. Not their motives, or their apparent access, or their move to Silk Road 2.0, and don't even get me started on what happened to the files they agreed to send Ross. Yet putting all of this aside for now, as we approach to the tail end of this video, I want to broaden the lens a bit, because while Alpacino is strange, he's far from the only thing in the Silk Road files that never got a satisfying answer.
When he asked for a lawyer, or if I did, it could be used against him. So we just had a conversation where I talked to him. He could say things to me, but then I would remind him that he asked for a lawyer and he'd have to waive that and all that. But we didn't talk about his case so much. We just talked about like human beings.
Did he, with his eyes, with his words, reveal any kind of regret, or did you see a human being changing, understanding something about themselves in the process of being caught?
No, I don't think that. I mean, he did offer me $20 million to let him go when we were driving to the jail.
Oh no!
And I asked him what we were gonna do with the agent that sat in the front seat.
The money really broke him, huh?
I think so. I think he kind of got caught up in how much money it was.
While the Silk Road was, in every meaningful sense, created and ran by Ross Ulbricht, there's still a difference between creating a project and being the person who actually builds it into its mature form. And that brings me to the Silk Road's hierarchy. Though obviously Ross was at the top, one step below that was Roger Clark. But aside from those two, there was another individual behind the scenes that reported to both of them. That being Smedley, who, for all intents and purposes, was the main developer behind Silk Road in its maturity. Though what often gets lost in translation is that with the other staff members, they mostly had the job of keeping business running smoothly. Smedley, in contrast, played a more direct role in growing and improving the site. First hired in 2012, by May of that year, they had fully replaced the developmental foundation, where in the process, he quickly became the site's highest paid employee. Listed in Ross's payroll, he has him slotted for about $2,500 a week, meaning he likely earned well into six figures for his work on Silk Road. Yet after completing a major overhaul to the site, Ross and Variety Jones seemed to keep him busy with their larger vision in mind, because as discussed earlier, a number of other side projects were also in the works by 2013. But here's the strange part. Despite the feds pursuing all of the other employees across the globe for their role in the criminal enterprise, Smedley was never charged, despite being one of the most instrumental employees in the entire operation. And what makes this even stranger is that his identity may have been leaked in a major hack. Although Mt. Gox and their cybersecurity failures need no introduction at this point, the data breaches there had allegedly tied various transactions to Smedley, where they had originated from payments from Variety Jones. Following this up, the researcher La Mustache had worked with Vice to follow the connection. The Bitcoin wallet found in Variety Jones' email account, dated May 9th, 2012, includes a series of transactions labeled by the user. Some are indicated as received from a Bitcoin mining pool, some are apparently for, quote, iPhone top-up, and others are sent to a wallet associated with the email address that Motherboard originally uncovered. The file also includes payments labeled as being sent to Charger and Smed, made over the latter half of 2012 for hundreds of Bitcoins at the time. Through an analysis of the blockchain, many of these payments were connected to an account at Mt. Gox, the failed Bitcoin exchange that was shut down in 2014. By referring to several leaked databases from Mt. Gox, it's possible to link specific deposits with individual users of the service. The first Mt. Gox dump from March 2014 contained information on trades as far back as 2011. The second, released in February 2015, was a redacted version of the exchange's user base. It included the names used by customers to sign up, as well as partial email addresses. By cross-referencing transactions detailed in Variety Jones's Bitcoin wallet with those two leaks, it is revealed that a large number of payments went to Charger and Smed, eventually arrive in a Mt. Gox account registered in the name Mike Wattier. An email in the Variety Jones account is also forwarded to an address with the same M. Wattier. On multiple social media and freelance developer sites, a Mike Wattier connected to the same email address found in the Variety Jones account identifies himself as an American with 20 years open source e-commerce experience, who is adept with a wide variety of programming languages. The same Wattier also appears to have a presence on Twitter, LinkedIn, and GitHub. Judging by his Facebook activity, he was in Pattaya, Thailand as of March of 2015. Some of his profiles list him as living on the Thai island of Go Chang. I should also add that this is the same location that the authorities had tracked Variety Jones to, but as the article continues, it is possible that the name could also be a pseudonym, though it seems clear that Clark did business with Wattier, unrelated, and prior to this analysis, a source in Thailand who knew Clark said that someone called Mike was Clark's erstwhile business partner. Despite the possibility that this name was just a pseudonym, This should have been fairly easy for law enforcement to figure out if they wanted to. Compelling as all that is, what's even stranger is that in the folder where Ross kept the IDs for his employees, all the familiar names are present, except Smedley's. Though I'm fairly certain the redacted file here is Roger Clark's ID. We actually know that Smedley was managed by Roger Clark because it's quite literally spelled out in his criminal complaint. But what's hard to understand is why Smedley was never charged. Ross may have created Silk Road, but the site in its original form had a ton of problems and kept getting hacked. Yet despite Smedley being the one who rebuilt the thing into something that actually worked, it's crazy that he was completely written out of existence from a law enforcement perspective. For contrast, the government went as far as to charge individuals like Shebang, real name Michael Wigand, for taking on a simple technical advisory role to Ross. So it's quite remarkable that to this day, Mike's website is still up, where, as far as I can tell, no serious effort was ever made to distance himself from these claims, as when the article first came out, both the FBI and Wadier declined to comment. Though I had initially heard a rumor that he may have served as a cooperating witness, when I asked the former FBI trial agent about that in our interview, he told me that such an arrangement would have surfaced in the documentation. Where absent any such paperwork, it appears that once again, we have another lead that wasn't fully pursued. Now, to finally return to the story about the Silk Road hedging system. Recall that Mt. Gox had turned over a key piece of intel to Baltimore after they were shaken down in May of 2013. But while their intel had made their way to that one division, it wouldn't be until after Ross was arrested that this particular thread of the story would be investigated by the New York prosecution. And as it turns out, Mt. Gox was attempting to notify law enforcement about a strange account on the exchange, where they later note the following. After receiving the records for the account, investigators working with the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Southern District of New York investigation of Silk Road were able to tie the David Maciano at Inbox.com Mt. Gox account to the defendant through various means. For example, Mt. Gox records showed the account being consistently accessed through IP addresses traced back to the defendant. Moreover, transactional records from the account were included as attachments to certain emails recovered from the defendant's Gmail account, which was searched pursuant to a search warrant. The defendant here is obviously in reference to Ross, and as it turns out, he had an account with an enormous amount of trading activity, totaling some 17,000 trades. While we do not have direct confirmation that this account was used for hedging, just listen to Mt. Gox describe the behavior here. The user deposited a large number of bitcoins into the account. The user used the bitcoins to purchase US dollars, but the account was never linked to a bank account to make a withdrawal. The transactional records for the account are too voluminous to provide via email. I'm happy to discuss a method and format to provide the records to you. Though for clarity, this comes from their back and forth with law enforcement. What's implied here is a very active trading account that would never cash out. And you can sort of think of this account as a substitute for Tether before anything like that existed. Graphing the account's activity, it doesn't match a clean one-to-one hedge you might expect if every order were matched directly. Rather, the trading seems more broadly clustered, where Ross seems to maintain a certain amount of Bitcoin at a time, where he would then liquidate large amounts in increments. So while it's not fully known how Ross managed his hedging process, we know some counterpart had to exist somewhere. As the Darknet researchers Gwern and Imposter had put it, this activity is consistent with either hedging or DPR1 being a trader who doesn't care about cashing out, and being so bad he could lose much of his money in a bull market. This is an astonishingly large amount of bitcoins, even at the time, which would have represented a large fraction of Mt. Gox's deposits and substantial trading volume. It seems difficult to believe that Mt. Gox did not at least suspect the account being linked to Silk Road 1. The insider claims they had not realized what the account was for until we began asking about it. Lack of clarity aside, what makes this incredibly interesting is that at some point, someone hacked this massive cache of Bitcoin. And this has never received any reporting. This is the largest loss that Ross had ever noted in his accounting, as it was worth nearly $2 million in 2013. And don't get this confused with the notorious Mt. Gox hack that occurred in 2014. This seems to be an isolated incident that is entirely separate. As the emails from Mt. Gox continue, in May of 2013, the user contacted Mt. Gox to report the account was hacked.
Mt. Gox informed the user that the email address associated with the account had been changed pursuant to a proper request to change the address. A copy of the exchange with the user regarding the hack is also attached to this email. Following the exchange attached to this email, this user did not communicate further with Mt. Gox, and Mt. Gox is not aware that the user made any report to law enforcement. Prior to the user contacting Mt. Gox regarding the hack, the approximately 1.9 million had been converted to bitcoins, where finally they note that the bitcoins were transferred to the following address, and some were sold on the exchange BTCE. So, to recap, someone managed to change the credentials on the account, where, after the hack, Ross inquires about it to no avail, and when nobody ever followed up on such a large amount of money, it became very obvious that this account was tied to something illicit. Given this fact, you can understand why Ross was so paranoid about the cooperation there with Baltimore. And while Ross had personally believed that the DEA had stole his money, there's not really any evidence that supports this. In reality, we have no idea who hacked Ross, as, like I said, I haven't seen any mainstream reporting on this. And this is intriguing because this is basically the last major cache of Bitcoin tied to Silk Road that has never been tracked down. Though Gwern and Imposter's analysis rule out any early data leaks, as Ross's account wasn't included in those at Mt. Gox, they settle on the possibility that this was either stolen by a Silk Road insider, for example, whoever had access to the code for his hedging system, or a Mt. Gox insider, where if they had recognized the account as being tied to Silk Road, they would have known there was effectively no recourse if they stole it. Though these are obviously just theories, as it stands today, it remains a mystery. In a chat log entry found on Ulbricht's computer in 2012, we can find him talking to one user by the name of DA, or Digital Alk. At the time, he was about to be promoted to a new key role, that being a moderator who would have the job of ensuring that vendors were compliant. Though he had worked for Ross as far back as 2011, everything seemed good until October of 2012, where in a later chat, he says that DA's gone for good, where it's not quite clear the reason for the split. Within a subsequent chat, just a week later, Variety Jones had claimed that he had sold something to DA previously and was repeatedly offering to track him down. Though their conversation is sidetracked, Ross does eventually give him the okay to find him, though nothing seemingly follows. There is a later reference in April of 2013, but it's only a passing comment. After discussing the various hits that had been commissioned by Red and White regarding Tony 76, Variety Jones writes, "Man, I still can't believe Tony fell into your lap. Wonder if DA is hanging around the edge of that mix." Though, like I said, statement in passing, given the context, it sort of implies that Digital Alk would be the next target if given the opportunity. And while we don't know why, one would assume that DA did something to get on Ross's bad side. Yet, despite the files not revealing much context, DA's story fits into a broader category, as a number of other employees had seemingly quit over the years. And the Silk Road's implied employee turnover problem is interesting, as there are a lot of other people that seemingly worked on the site before Ross had started collecting IDs. Just to name a few, there's Limitless, Squid Shepherd, and In Light Of. Though all of these usernames are tied to the Silk Road forum, there are two other names, SYG and Utah, who consistently show up on the payroll in late 2011. Though I believe Utah may have been another early developer, for those employees that had not provided Ross their ID, they were never seemingly charged, as I've seen no follow-up on any of these names. So, you know the laptop that we've been going through this whole time? This actually isn't the same laptop that Ross created Silk Road with. But if you actually look through Ross's accounting, he made a purchase for a laptop on April 28th, 2012. The expense was for $1,150. And if you look at the metadata for the files on Ross's computer, you'll notice that none of the files are copied over before May 8th, 2012, just a week later. As it turns out, the directory for the user on the PC, Frosty, was also created earlier that night. But this also raises the question as to what happened to the PC that had been used for the majority of the Silk Road's existence.
Outside of my own look-through, I've never seen any reporting on this detail either. But while we're on the subject of devices that the feds never got access to, there's also this whole situation with Variety Jones. You see, before Clark had been arrested, he wrote publicly that he feared for his life and attempted to turn himself over, as he had allegedly been in contact with a corrupt FBI agent whom he claimed had the username Diamond. Reportedly, Diamond had stolen a massive cache of Silk Road Bitcoin, but apparently still needed help as it was held in an encrypted file, though he had apparently been under the impression that Roger Clark or Ross had access to the password. It's hard to take this story seriously, as Clark never provided any actual evidence. Irregardless, when he was finally taken into custody, he reportedly had all of his devices encrypted. Yet, despite the DOJ's press release noting a $1.6 million penalty, there are no further details regarding his devices or his crypto stash. Yet, with all of these loose ends now laid out for you, you may be wondering whether any of them will receive any additional clarity in the future. Looking to the past, new pieces of the story have often emerged when the DOJ prosecutes another thread connected to Silk Road. But given how many years it's been, that seems less likely for the minor mysteries I've shown you. Arguably, any situation where there's still some Bitcoin sitting dormant, the government has shown it will monitor anything they can later make a claim to. So while perhaps there's a chance, taking a look at where Ross is today, the story obviously hasn't stopped there either.
That Ross, that he saw this through, that he was responsible for more than kind of the creation of Silk Road.
Correct.
Not for a minute. They've traced lots of money back to Ross. What do you think Ross's role was?
I have no idea. I'd like to see the evidence. That's what we're waiting. We can't speculate. I mean, we want to bring our own Bitcoin expert in, and the prosecution has asked the judge to block that.
Part of why you want to speak out a little bit is you're frustrated.
Absolutely. The most frustrating thing is that evidence that is favorable to Ross is being suppressed.
Vote for me on day one. I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht. He's already served 11 years. We're going to get him home.
Among more than 1,000 people pardoned or given reduced sentences is Ross Ulbricht, who founded the Silk Road. He was convicted of running the underground online marketplace that facilitated more than $200 million in illicit transactions using Bitcoin. Well, he was sentenced in 2015 to life in prison. Trump took to the social media platform Truth Social to explain his reasoning here, writing, "The scum that worked to convict him were some of the same lunatics who were involved in the modern-day weaponization of government against me."
Moving up to the modern day, it's quite ironic that Ross quite literally wrote in his journal that he believed his story would be retold one day, which is part of why he kept such detailed logs. Yet when the blockbuster finally arrived, the movie adaptation ignored this completely. As I've said before, the evidence-based version of the story has always been inconvenient to the agendas surrounding this case. For the government, they obviously wanted to make an example out of Ross, as well as emphasize a clean victory, where obviously they aren't as conversant when it comes to the misconduct and loose ends. And for Ross's supporters, the story has always been twisted in the opposite direction, recasting him as a political icon who outplayed the government at its own game, while ultimately ignoring the fact that he had succumbed to his darkest fear, that being becoming too drunk with power. With this video, I wanted to paint a clear picture of the case as a whole in our revisitation, as our first episode spent more time on the moral decline that Ross later experienced. Yet, no matter where you stand on Ross himself today, the reality is that he's now a free man, as he was pardoned on January 21st, 2025, and given another shot at life. Since then, he's chosen to maintain a moderate profile, dipping his toes into the political world, but not getting into too much detail. Despite him being able to land any interview or podcast that he wants to tell his side of the story, he has mostly chosen to speak at public events where he will monologue, though the first 3 speeches centered largely on his time in prison. I have to say, I was somewhat taken aback by Ross's 4th speech, given July 12, 2025, as it seems he makes a complete political turnaround. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first time he completely renounced his original creation.
So,
I made it through, and I learned a thing or two along the way, and that's really what I want to do here today is share you some of the things I learned from that experience. So, because I sat behind a computer screen when I broke the law, I was sealed off in this kind of sanitary bubble. Nothing bad could get through to me. And I hid what I was doing from the people in my life because I didn't want to get in trouble. So I had no one to give me critical feedback, to question what I was doing. All I heard was encouragement from the Silk Road users and my own thoughts, which told me, hey, you're a hero for standing up for freedom and for what you believe is right. I was never exposed to the terrible consequences of addiction and the negative effects that rippled out from Silk Road into the world. But that changed when I was arrested. I spent over 11 years in maximum security federal prisons. I met scores of men who are addicted to harmful drugs. I helped some of them in the long, arduous process of overcoming those addictions. And what I learned is that addiction destroys lives. It destroys families. It destroys communities. And I see now that equating drug use and freedom is hopelessly naive. And here's why. Someone who's addicted to drugs, their neurochemistry is hijacked. They're not free. They are hopelessly enslaved in the most pernicious way imaginable. Imagine this. Imagine there's a button. Imagine there's a button right here on this stage, on this podium. And if I push that button, it will eliminate all drugs from our world. It will make them chemically impossible to exist. Gone forever. Imagine that. Would you push that button? I believe that I would push the button. And I believe that the world will be a better place for it. But here's the thing to understand. The government is not that button. That button does not exist. That's a fantasy. Drugs exist. Outlawing them is not that button. Outlawing drugs is not a viable way to make them go away. Unfortunately, sadly, because addiction is incredibly harmful. Addiction and drug use is complicated. It raises deep, important questions about freedom, about political freedom and personal freedom. Making a website and giving people free rein to buy and sell drugs is not the answer. And I want my supporters to hear this. Okay, it's not the answer because now I have to live with the fact that I played a role in people losing their freedom to addiction. That'll weigh on my conscience for the rest of my life.
Though the rest of the speech does actually include a fairly nuanced perspective on the war on drugs. He even brushes up against organized crime, mentioning the violence it leads to. Yet notably, he stops short of acknowledging the darkest part of his record. Yet despite this being the first time I'd ever seen him discuss the morality of Silk Road publicly, I found it interesting that the speech was not very popular, and the reception was rather lukewarm. So many of the comments on Twitter don't even engage with what's being said, and the YouTube comment section was effectively insulated from any outside criticism. The comments across the channel were paused. But that aside, it's hard not to notice how the messaging around Ross has repeatedly shifted. When he was first arrested, the legal emphasis was on the idea that he had been framed, that there were multiple DPRs, and that the government's case was fundamentally misleading. Then, once that became harder to sustain, the public emphasis moved towards the harshness of the sentence, leaning heavily on things like Ross's letter to the judge, where he recast Silk Road less as a money-making venture and more so the product of a libertarian idealist. Like, I kid you not, in his letter he claimed that this was always about personal freedom, and that he didn't know how people would use that freedom. I mean, never mind the fact that the first thing listed on his website were mushrooms that were personally grown and shipped by him. But then after getting out of prison, he goes on to claim that this was all about a lack of critical feedback. If only someone had told him. And I seriously can't help but roll my eyes at how often this story has been patched over. But the absurdity doesn't end there, as there's also the fact that the very president who pardoned him is simultaneously taking a hard line on drug traffickers, as if Ross was an exception based on principle and not just someone that was politically useful for the election. And to be clear, I'm not here to sway your opinion on the drug war. I've actually always agreed that Ross's sentencing was over the top when compared to the others. Rather, what I like to point out is how elastic the logic becomes whenever the politics call for it. And even still, I can't buy into the idea that it was a tragedy that he went to prison in the first place for simply running a website. He's lucky to be free, yet most of his speeches still carry that underlying tone.
Just a few months ago, I was trapped behind those prison walls and didn't know if I would ever get out. And now I'm free. I'm free, and it's because of you. You made this moment possible. Can you feel that? Let that sink in. You did this. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you're not alone. You are part of something much bigger. This is bigger than Bitcoin. This is bigger than crypto. Freeing me took many, many people from all walks of life coming together and saying, this is not right. It took many people just like you saying, we care about freedom. And keeping somebody like Ross in a cage until he dies is a threat to freedom itself.
Though I don't doubt that prison was probably terrible, that's kind of the point. As if building a website to traffic narcotics was ever supposed to end at a retirement party. Rather, Ross was fully aware that he could go to jail and even had chats with Variety Jones about what to do in the event of an incarceration. My favorite line there was,
I've been thinking about that a bit as well. Like I could put instructions for transferring control in an encrypted file and give it to a family member. Then I can give them the password if I get put in jail.
Though it's definitely interesting to see Ross hint at turning Silk Road into a family business if he ever gets caught. Perhaps in hindsight, this makes perfect sense, given how much his family has had his back since the very beginning. And credit where it's due, even though Ross's mother has been at the helm of the political campaign around his case, seemingly playing the game, doing and saying whatever to advocate for him. I still genuinely have to commend her on her accomplishment. It's genuinely impressive that they pulled this off. As I remember vividly back in 2019, the idea seemed like a complete joke. More specifically, while a pardon was far-fetched, the idea that Trump would be the one to pardon him was even more bizarre. You see, at the time, Trump used to be firmly anti-crypto, going as far as to call it a scam, fake money, and perhaps all of the usual anecdotes. But come his second term, it's a very different story. There's been no shortage of meme coins, NFTs, and what can only be described as blatant rug pulls. So while integrity has clearly gone out the window, Ross's pardon sits comfortably within a broader web of political hypocrisy. And what makes this even crazier is realizing how both sides actually benefited. Silk Road generated billions in seizures for the government. And for Ross, he received a plethora of support after being released, where someone went as far as to mysteriously donate $31 million. Though early speculation suggests Ross may have been attempting to donate to himself using leftover Silk Road Bitcoin, later blockchain analysis cited by Wired, Chainalysis, and ZachXBT actually pinpointed the origin as Alphabay. As one article put it, Chainalysis has reasonable grounds to suspect the funds originated in Alphabay. A company spokesman told Fortune. The news was first reported by Wired. Chainalysis Director of Investigations, Phil Larrett, told that outlet that the number of bitcoins suggests they came from someone who was possibly a vendor on Alphabay back in the early days. But adding on to that, another article states, Wired reported that it contacted Chainalysis, which pointed to the donation's origin, and ZachXBT, who reviewed the transaction and described it in a message to the outlet as, quote, a legitimate donation, but not legitimate funds. The Bitcoin donation has come from old Alphabay wallets that had not moved funds since the market was shut down in 2017. Whoever donated had long-term access to those wallets. That points to someone directly tied to Alphabay, possibly a former vendor, an insider, or a loyal supporter who never cashed out. Though obviously there could be some legal scrutiny if the funds were illicit. When this was discovered, Ross's supporters were shaming people for even talking about this. Though at the time, it seems he declined to comment. Ironically, a month later, he gave that very same speech we saw earlier, where he claimed to be remorseful as a result of profiting off of addiction. Irregardless, to date, I have not seen any further update. And at the time of me making this video, it seems Ulbricht has taken a step away from the public sphere.
Obviously, we're here for Operation Hit and Eye. The warrant and the attachment B were sent out via email last night to everybody. SWAT is going to be conducting the arrest.
If you guys have any questions, just let me know. But if be on special lookout for hardware wallets, they look like USB keys typically. Some look exactly like USB.
The charges are money laundering, drug trafficking, so those are primarily the things we're going to be looking for.
You'll hear us today for 3. Instruction 1, instruction 2, we unload schedule. So we
have drives, computers, laptops, phones.
So we're just asking that dogs have first dibs on the room. J-Code led the effort of Operation Saboteur by collectively working together to create leads for the field. And those leads were sent out to all of our domestic partners in which they worked together to go out and interview Darknet drug users as well as effect arrest of drug traffickers. J-Code brings together experts from the DEA, the Postal Inspection Service, Homeland Security Investigations, as well as the Department of Defense and the Customs and Border Protection, along with the FBI.
Though you are now caught up with the developments that followed Ross's pardon, I want to circle back and tie off the bigger picture of this deep dive. As it is apparent that so much of the story has still fallen by the wayside all these years later, whether it be something not followed up on by the media, or threads of the story that were left in the files of law enforcement, it's apparent that much of the evidence here never got its due. And when it comes to the saga surrounding Alpacino, it's a story that got a passing mention at best, with almost no real context. But if I told you plainly that Ross had a law enforcement officer on his payroll, that this person repeatedly promised him an advance warning on his investigation, offered him intel on vendor arrests, as well as a competing investigation, and then later scrubbed himself out of the files entirely, that's not a small story. That alone should have dominated the conversation around this case. Though lingering questions remain on what further intel was fed to Ross within the final weeks. The fact that this individual later moves on to a similar role in Silk Road 2.0, where they can later be found running cover for whoever hacked the site, is equally intriguing. Yet, I can't help but take a look back on all of this and question, if we walked away from so much in what was the most well-documented darknet market in history, what does that say about all of the other cases thereafter? As D'Agostino pointed out, cases like the Silk Road are incredibly rare, specifically because they went to trial. And that's largely why we have access to this much information at all. According to Pew Research, in 2022, nearly 90% of federal defendants pleaded guilty, 8% had their cases dismissed, and only about 2% ever saw a courtroom. That's just 2% of the cases where we even get to see the full evidence, which is pretty concerning given that Carl's misconduct was never flagged internally. He quite literally signed off using his real name, Yet, what actually triggered the alarm was Bitstamp filing a report on his activity. Only after looking into that did investigators notice Sean Bridges. And to add insult to injury, they couldn't even finish looking into all the suspected usernames tied to Carl before turning up a third corrupt agent. Though all said and done with, I can't help but notice that both men acted as though they were untouchable, where unfortunately, this is a recurring problem with low visibility policing. Without oversight, people will attempt to get away with whatever consequences allow for. But keep in mind, this is before proper OPSEC practices were tried and tested. These days, darknet markets have even less visibility, as most sites would later come to adopt currencies like Monero. And in theory, this change alone would make corruption far more tempting. The only reason these two were caught was because they were able to follow the money. Taking that away, it's already difficult enough to build a case against people running these sites, let alone misconduct, which isn't as fervently pursued. But if you were around when we covered the evolution of the darknet from 2014 to 2019, we saw that in post-Silk Road cases, defendants would always plead out, although we learned who was arrested, how much was seized, as well as some general details on the overarching operation. Oftentimes, we were left speculating on the bigger picture. And this trend continues with more recent operations. Disruptor, Dark Hunter, Spectre, Raptor. The darknet takedowns now are largely led by J-Code. And while law enforcement efforts have only grown more streamlined, producing larger and larger takedowns, darknet markets have proven to be an incredibly resilient sector. Per Chainalysis, year after year, the ecosystem persists. It's just that perhaps the stories emerging from it have steadily shrunk in the public's consciousness. Outside of that occasional breakout story, like the Incognito one a couple years back, I can imagine some people writing off darknet market drama as perhaps a thing of the past. But consider this, crypto crime originates here. Yet to date, despite the well-documented problem with low visibility law enforcement, there's been virtually no corruption charged in relation to later darknet cases. Outside of one NCA agent who stole 50 Bitcoin directly from DPR2's seized wallet after he was in prison in 2017, looking far and wide, it would appear that law enforcement has completely solved corruption on the darknet, despite crypto crime creeping into every other part of our society. Obviously, I don't buy into that version of reality. Look no further than the other parts of government that get audited for their crypto practices, and the contrast isn't pretty. In 2022, the DOJ's own Inspector General audited how the U.S. Marshals, the primary custodian of all federally seized assets, were tracking cryptocurrency. What they found was that the DOJ's official asset tracking system didn't even have the functionality to manage crypto. So instead, agents were logging hundreds of millions of dollars in seized assets on basic spreadsheets. Spreadsheets that, according to auditors, could be edited or deleted without leaving any record. On top of that, when the Treasury Inspector General reviewed the IRS Criminal Division, they found that 43% of their seized crypto was not located where their own inventory system said it was. As of late 2023, they had custody of roughly $8 billion in digital assets tied to open cases, and frequently they weren't following their own documentation procedures. In one case, 3 encrypted hardware wallets just vanished after an agent claimed to have handed them off before leaving the agency. In another, staff accidentally shredded a seed recovery phrase. In 3 other cases, no seizure memorandum was ever filed at all. But beyond that, earlier this year, crypto researcher ZachXBT alleged that over $40 million in crypto had been stolen from the US government's wallets, and the person responsible was the son of the president of a company that the US Marshals Service had specifically hired to safeguard those exact wallets. Real name John DeGita, he has since been arrested. But given that the government has repeatedly faced large gaps in oversight elsewhere, I'd argue that the absence of documentation isn't proof of a clean system. Rather, it's just an absence of evidence. The goings-on here are opaque, and it seems all too convenient that the only major darknet case to fully run its course at trial produced seemingly 3 separate threads of misconduct, yet nothing comparable has surfaced in the 13 years since. Now, obviously, this is not to take away from these divisions and the legitimate work here, but a prerequisite to accountability is visibility, which can be at odds with the goals of government in this particular area. Once a method is known to one side, the other side adapts. So the goal is to never have the details publicly known, as it makes law enforcement's job harder. And there's a deeper contradiction which underpins all of this. If the state has allowances to break the law, to enforce the law, then the distinction between the good guys and the bad guys starts to blur. And whenever a light is finally shown in one of these cases, you can be left asking whether you're being protected from criminals or governed by them. Though I think the record shows HSI Chicago as undercover work done right, there are obviously no body cams in the Darknet. But in the public sphere, this transparency often reveals how frequently misconduct actually occurs. And with the Silk Road case, it was also unusual because it occurred before this new era of Darknet enforcement. Since then, a particular substance has been labeled public enemy number 1. And even before that, the FBI-led J-Code initiative was also a direct response to that one crisis. As it stands today, there's now this broader national security issue tied into these investigations. And while this may create pressure for these specific divisions to show results, lest they fail to justify their own existence, anytime multiple agencies or governments are collaborating, misconduct can become intertwined with diplomacy, creating even less incentive for anybody to rock the boat. And if corruption thrives in the dark, then what's the public to do when plea incentives make it so you can't see the details? The national security issue makes it inconvenient to ask questions, and the multi-jurisdictional crypto environment makes it so you can't follow the money. Look, I'm not saying that corruption is rampant on the Darknet. What I am saying is the last time we really got to check, it wasn't pretty. Yet, as it stands today, the files on Ross's laptop are still the clearest picture we have on how these cases actually run from the inside. Look past the players and the game itself hasn't changed that much. Whoever ends up in the hot seat ends up with the same problems that Ross did. The same characters trying to hustle them, the same informant whispers, the same never-ending hacks, and the same inability to tell what's real until it's too late. Yet, despite the Silk Road case being said and done with today, perhaps lightning doesn't strike twice. Or maybe, just maybe, the laptop serves as a template for some of the stories still happening behind the curtain. This is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.